Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The neon sign buzzed like a dying insect, casting sickly pink light across the cracked asphalt. Moonlight Motel, vacancy, it proclaimed, though I suspected the vacancy had been permanent for years. My Honda's engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound besides the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. 3 days of driving through the Midwest had left me hollow-eyed and desperate for any horizontal surface that wasn't a car seat. The lobby reeked of cigarettes and industrial disinfectant that couldn't quite mask something else, something organic and sour. Behind the scratched plexiglass partition, a clerk with yellowed teeth slid me a key attached to a plastic diamond. Room 237. The numbers were worn smooth, as if countless fingers had traced them in the dark. I should have kept driving. The second-floor hallway stretched before me like a throat, illuminated by fluorescent lights that flickered with seizure-inducing irregularity. Brown carpet, once perhaps gold, squelched beneath my feet. The walls were covered in a pattern that might have been floral decades ago, now faded to the color of old bruises. I counted doors as I walked. 231, 233, 235. Each one identical, each one somehow watchful. Room 237 sat at the far end, isolated from its neighbors by a utility closet, and what appeared to be a permanently sealed door marked 238. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal my temporary sanctuary. Or so I thought. The room was a monument to decay masquerading as hospitality. Water stains bloomed across the popcorn ceiling like aerial views of brown continents. The bedspread, a riot of orange and gold that would have been garish even in the 70s, lay askew over a mattress that sagged in the middle like a hammock. But it was the walls that caught my attention, covered in the same wallpaper as the hallway, except here it had begun to peel. Long strips of the pattern hung like dead skin, curling at the edges to reveal patches of yellowed adhesive and the dark wood beneath. In some places, entire sections had fallen away, leaving irregular windows into the wall's interior. I set my overnight bag on the dresser and approached one of these gaps, curious despite my exhaustion. The space between the wallpaper and the wood was deeper than it should have been. Instead of finding the expected quarter-inch of air, my fingers encountered what felt like a hollow several inches deep. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and peered into the darkness. The light revealed a narrow space that seemed to extend further than the room's dimensions should have allowed. Horizontal wooden beams created a grid-like structure, and as I moved the light, I caught glimpses of what looked like a network of passages running parallel to the walls. The wood was old and darkened with age, smooth in places as if worn by frequent contact. I told myself it was just the building's construction. Old hotels often had unusual interior spaces for utilities and structural support. But as I pulled back from the gap, I could have sworn I heard something. A soft shuffling sound, like fabric against wood. Exhaustion won over curiosity. I needed sleep more than I needed to investigate the architectural quirks of a decrepit motel. I pulled the heavy dresser away from its position against the wall, intending to position it near the bed where I could use it as a makeshift nightstand. But as I dragged it across the threadbare carpet, something made me pause. The shuffling sound had returned, and now it seemed to come from inside the wall behind where the dresser had been standing. I pressed my ear to the faded wallpaper and listened. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as the building settling, I heard it again, definitely movement, and definitely from within the wall itself. I grabbed the loose edge of a wallpaper strip and pulled. It came away easily, revealing another of those deep gaps. This one was larger, and when I shined my light into it, I could see further into the network of passages that seemed to honeycomb the building's interior. The wooden beams formed corridors barely wide enough for a person to navigate, and they stretched in both directions beyond the reach of my light. That's when I saw the first one. A shadow moved across the far end of the passage, human-shaped but impossibly thin. It appeared for just a moment in the periphery of my flashlight beam before melting back into the darkness. I jerked the light back to where I'd seen it, but found only empty corridor. My rational mind offered explanations. Tricks of light and shadow, patterns created by the irregular beams. My overtired brain processing visual noise as movement. But some deeper instinct was already backing me away from the wall, already sending adrenaline surging through my bloodstream. I decided to move the dresser against the door, a habit from too many nights in questionable motels. As I wrestled the heavy piece of furniture across the room, the shuffling sounds returned, louder now and coming from multiple directions. It was as if my investigation had awakened something that had been dormant in the walls. The dresser scraped against the door with a sound like fingernails on wood. I tested it, satisfied that it would at least slow down any unwanted visitors. But as I turned back toward the bed, the noises from within the walls intensified. Now I could hear what sounded almost like whispers, sibilant sounds that might have been voices if they weren't quite so distorted by their passage through the wooden maze. I approached another gap in the wallpaper, this one near the head of the bed, and listened. The whispers resolved into something that chilled me more than the October air seeping through the poorly sealed windows. They sounded like complaints, like irritated mutterings, and unless my exhausted mind was playing elaborate tricks on me, they seemed to be about me. I caught fragments that made my skin crawl. Our space, and doesn't belong, and most distinctly, get out of our bed. I backed away from the wall, my heart hammering. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was experiencing some form of exhaustion-induced hallucination. I'd been driving for 3 days straight, living on gas station coffee and convenience store sandwiches. My brain was simply processing the ambient sounds of an old building through the filter of extreme fatigue. But the sounds were becoming more distinct, more purposeful. I could hear movement throughout the wall network now, as if multiple figures were navigating the hidden corridors. The whispers had grown more agitated, and I was certain I could make out more words. Sleeping. Our place. Make him leave. Against every instinct, I approached the largest gap in the wallpaper and peered into the passage. My flashlight illuminated the narrow corridor, and this time I was ready when a shadow moved across the far end. I kept the light steady, and for just a moment I saw it clearly. It was humanoid but wrong, elongated and flattened, as if someone had been compressed to fit through spaces too narrow for a normal person. The figure moved with fluid grace through the wooden framework, and when it reached a junction in the passages, it turned toward me. I couldn't make out features in the distance and dim light, but I had the unmistakable sensation of being observed. The figure raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. Then it opened what might have been a mouth and issued a sound that was part whisper, part hiss, and entirely hostile. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The light spun crazily across the ceiling before settling on the floor, casting wild shadows that danced and writhed. When I scrambled to retrieve it and turned the beam back to the wall, the gap was empty. But the sounds had multiplied. Now I could hear movement throughout the walls. Not just one figure, but many. They seemed to be converging, moving through their hidden network toward my room. The whispers had become a chorus of irritated voices, all variations on the same theme. I was trespassing, I was unwelcome, I needed to leave. The most disturbing realization was that they seemed to know exactly where I was. As I moved around the room, the sounds followed me, tracking my position from within the walls. When I approached the bed, the whispers grew more agitated. When I moved toward the door, they became almost frantic. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what was happening. The rational explanations were wearing thin. Even severe exhaustion couldn't account for the complexity and consistency of what I was experiencing. But the alternative, that the walls of this decaying motel were somehow inhabited by entities that could move through hidden passages, was equally impossible to accept. The bed springs creaked as I shifted my weight, and the sound triggered an immediate response from within the walls. The whispers exploded into angry hisses, and something began pounding against the wall behind the headboard. Not a gentle tapping or the random settling of old wood, deliberate, rhythmic blows that shook the thin wallpaper. I leaped off the bed as if it had become electrified. The pounding continued, joined by similar sounds from other walls. They were all around me now, these impossible inhabitants of the building's skeleton, and they were clearly agitated by my presence on what they considered their territory. "Our bed," came a whisper that seemed to emerge from multiple gaps simultaneously. "Get out of our bed." The voice was clearer now, though still distorted by its passage through the wooden maze. It sounded human but aged, worn thin like the wallpaper itself, and it was joined by others, creating a chorus of complaint and demand. I grabbed my overnight bag and headed for the door, but as I pushed against the dresser, the sounds in the walls reached a crescendo of rage. The pounding became violent, and I could see the wallpaper actually moving as something struck it from behind. Strips of paper began falling like dead leaves, revealing more and more of the gaps that led into their domain. That's when I realized my mistake. Each falling piece of wallpaper created another opening, another potential exit from their hidden world into mine. The entities had been contained within their network of passages, but my investigation and the vibrations from moving the dresser had weakened the barriers between their space and the room. Through the largest gap, I caught sight of movement much closer than before. One of the elongated figures was approaching the opening, moving with clear intent. As it drew near, I could see more details that made my stomach lurch. It was human in general shape, but stretched and flattened, as if it had been slowly compressed over years of moving through spaces too small for normal anatomy. Its face, when it turned toward me, was a grotesque caricature of human features. Eyes too wide, mouth too broad, everything distorted by whatever process had adapted it to life within the walls. It reached the gap and began to push through, its impossible anatomy allowing it to squeeze through an opening barely 3 inches wide. I could see others behind it, a queue of flattened humanity waiting their turn to emerge from their wooden prison. I shoved against the dresser with desperate strength, feeling it slide inch by inch away from the door. Behind me, I could hear the first entity pulling itself into the room with sounds like leather scraping against wood. The others were growing more agitated, their whispers becoming shrieks of excitement or rage. The dresser finally moved enough for me to squeeze through the door. I burst into the hallway, not bothering to close the door behind me, and ran for the stairs. The fluorescent lights flickered more violently than before, and I could swear I heard sounds of pursuit from within the walls of the hallway itself. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, and I kept glancing up at the second-floor windows, expecting to see flattened faces pressed against the glass. But the windows remained dark, and gradually the adrenaline began to subside. As I sat in my car, catching my breath and trying to process what had happened, I began to doubt my own memories. The exhaustion that had driven me to stop at the motel was still there, perhaps worse than before. Could I have experienced some kind of complete psychological break? Was it possible that my overtired mind had constructed an elaborate hallucination from the innocent sounds of an old building and the play of shadows in peeling wallpaper? I looked up at room 237's window one more time. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement behind the glass. Not the normal movement of someone walking past a window, but something sliding across the surface from the inside, as if pressed flat against the glass. Then the neon sign flickered off, plunging the motel facade into darkness, and I could see nothing at all. I drove through the night, stopping only when the sun was high enough to burn away the memory of shadows and whispers. But even now, months later, I find myself avoiding hotels with old wallpaper. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the dark, I listen carefully to the sounds within the walls. Because once you know that the space between the surface and the structure might not be empty, you can never quite ignore the possibility that something might be moving through those hidden passages, looking for a way out. Or worse, looking for someone who has intruded upon their domain. The official explanation I've settled on is exhaustion-induced hallucination compounded by the natural sounds of an aging building. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation that accounts for everything I experienced. I just wish I could make myself believe it. Story 2. Fluorescent lights of the convenience store cast their harsh glow across the wet asphalt as I stepped outside, the familiar electronic chime fading behind me. October rain had turned the streets into mirrors, reflecting the scattered streetlights in wavering pools that seemed to shift and writhe with each passing car. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, the plastic bag containing my late-night purchases, energy drinks and instant ramen, the staples of any college student's diet, crinkling against my chest. The campus was only a 15-minute walk, but at this hour, past midnight, the route felt longer. The commercial strip gave way to residential streets lined with old oak trees, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the amber streetlight into dancing shadows. My footsteps echoed off the wet pavement, creating a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. That's when I first noticed the headlights. They appeared in my peripheral vision as I turned onto Maple Street, twin orbs of pale yellow light that seemed dimmer than they should be, like the glow from old incandescent bulbs, rather than modern halogens. I glanced over my shoulder but couldn't make out the vehicle itself, just those oddly muted lights maintaining a steady distance behind me. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by years of late-night study sessions and caffeine-fueled logic, dismissed it immediately. Cars drove down streets. That's what they did. The fact that this one happened to be traveling in the same direction I was walking meant nothing more than coincidence. But as I continued walking, something felt wrong. The car never seemed to get closer or farther away. It maintained that same distance, those dim headlights hovering at the edge of my vision like watching eyes. When I walked faster, the lights seemed to keep pace. When I slowed down, they slowed too. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of midterms and too many sleepless nights was making me paranoid. I turned left onto Birch Avenue, my sneakers squeaking against the wet sidewalk. The headlights followed, making the turn with a smoothness that seemed almost mechanical, like they were on rails rather than controlled by human hands. The sound that should have accompanied the vehicle, the low rumble of an engine, the whisper of tires on wet asphalt, was absent, swallowed by the night's strange quietude. My pulse quickened, sending blood rushing through my ears with a sound like distant ocean waves. I could feel sweat beginning to form under my jacket despite the October chill, and my breathing became more shallow, more deliberate. The plastic bag crinkled with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. 3 blocks from campus, I decided to test my growing paranoia. At the next intersection, instead of continuing straight toward the university, I turned right onto a side street that would take me in a completely different direction. The headlights followed without hesitation, maintaining that same unsettling distance. My throat felt dry, and I swallowed hard, tasting the metallic flavor of fear. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Someone was following me, staying just far enough back to avoid identification while keeping me in sight. The street I'd chosen was darker than the main route, with fewer streetlights and houses set farther back from the road. If someone wanted to confront me, this would be the perfect place. I pulled out my phone, the blue glow of the screen feeling like a lifeline in the growing darkness. My fingers trembled slightly as I scrolled through my contacts, but who would I call? Campus security? The police? What would I tell them? That someone was driving behind me on a public street? The headlights continued their patient pursuit, and I noticed something else odd about them. They seemed to flicker occasionally, not like electrical problems, but like flames guttering in wind. And there was something about their positioning that struck me as wrong. They were too low to the ground, too wide apart, like they belonged to a vehicle from a different era. I turned onto another side street, then another, creating a random zigzag pattern that no one with legitimate business would follow. But the lights stayed with me, patient and persistent, never wavering from their position in my peripheral vision. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was someone from school playing a prank. Maybe it was a coincidence and the driver was just as lost as I was pretending to be. But deep down, in a place that existed before reason and logic, something primitive was screaming warnings. 4 blocks into my improvised route, I realized I was completely lost. The residential streets all looked the same in the darkness. Identical mailboxes, similar driveways, houses that blurred together in the dim light. Panic began to edge into my consciousness, a cold finger tracing up my spine. I was alone, lost, and being followed by someone who clearly had more patience than good intentions. I turned down what I hoped was another residential street, but this one felt different. The houses were farther apart, older, with deep yards that disappeared into shadows. The streetlights seemed dimmer here, casting pools of weak yellow light that barely touched the sidewalk. And still, those headlights followed, maintaining their vigil with mechanical precision. That's when it happened. I was passing under a large maple tree when the car behind me suddenly accelerated. I heard it for the first time then. Not the sound of a modern engine, but something deeper, rougher, like the growl of machinery from decades past. The headlights grew brighter, casting my shadow long and stark against the wet pavement ahead. I broke into a run, my sneakers slapping against the sidewalk, the plastic bag bouncing against my chest. Behind me, the engine noise grew louder, closer, and I could hear the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. But there was something wrong with the sound. It was too hollow, too echo-filled, like hearing music from the bottom of a well. I glanced back over my shoulder and felt my blood turn to ice water. The car was right behind me, close enough that I should be able to see its make and model, its license plate, the face of the driver. Instead, I saw only a vague outline, like looking at something through heavy fog. It was an old car, that much was clear. The headlights were round and widely spaced, the bumper chrome and ornate, but the details seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them. And it was close, too close. I veered left, jumping the curb and cutting across someone's front yard, hoping to put obstacles between myself and my pursuer. The wet grass was slippery under my feet and I stumbled, catching myself against a decorative fence post. Behind me, I heard the car slow but not stop. The headlights swept across the yard, illuminating me in their pale glow. Then something impossible happened. The car didn't stop at the curb. It didn't turn around or try to follow me onto the sidewalk. Instead, it drove straight through the fence post I was leaning against, through the yard, through me. I felt it pass through my body like a wave of cold air, a sensation that started at my back and moved through my chest, leaving me breathless and nauseous. The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment, colors bleeding into each other like watercolors in rain. When my vision cleared, the car was on the other side of me, continuing down the street as if nothing had happened. But there were no tire tracks in the wet grass, no broken fence posts, no damage of any kind. I stood there in the yard, shaking, my mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Hallucination, I told myself. Stress-induced breakdown, too much caffeine and not enough sleep. People didn't just drive through other people. Cars were made of metal and glass and rubber, solid physical things that obeyed the laws of physics. But I could still feel the cold spot where the car had passed through me, a lingering chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The headlights had stopped about 50 feet down the street and were beginning to turn around. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. The car was coming back. I ran. My feet pounded against the sidewalk as I sprinted down the street, no longer caring about direction or destination. I just needed to get away from those lights, from whatever impossible thing was pursuing me. My lungs burned with each breath, and the plastic bag had torn, spilling its contents behind me in a trail of energy drinks and plastic-wrapped noodles. Behind me, I could hear the car following, its engine making that hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The headlights cast dancing shadows as they bounced with the vehicle's movement, and I realized that the car was gaining on me. I turned a corner and saw salvation ahead. The steeple of St. Mary's Cathedral rising above the tree line, its bell tower illuminated by spotlights. The church was still 6 blocks away, but it was something to aim for, a destination that felt safe in a way I couldn't articulate. The engine sound behind me changed, becoming more urgent, more aggressive. I risked another glance back and saw the car accelerating again, its vague outline becoming clearer in the reflected light from the street lamps. It was old, possibly from the 1960s, with tail fins and chrome bumpers. But there was something wrong with its proportions, something that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the details. And there were people inside it. Not just a driver, but passengers filling every seat. I caught glimpses of pale faces pressed against the windows, mouths open as if they were screaming, though no sound reached me. Their eyes were dark holes in faces that seemed to flicker between solid and translucent, and they were all looking at me with an expression of desperate hunger. I ran harder, my chest burning with each breath. The church was getting closer, its bell tower growing larger against the night sky. 4 blocks. 3. The car behind me was close enough now that I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. 2 blocks from the church, I felt something brush against my back. Not physical contact, but something colder and more invasive. The sensation spread through my body like ice water in my veins, and for a moment, I felt myself slowing down, as if my legs were moving through thick liquid instead of air. The faces in the car were clearer now, and I could see that they weren't really people anymore. They were impressions of people, shadows of what they had once been, trapped in an endless journey that had long ago ceased to have meaning, and they wanted me to join them. I forced myself to keep running, fighting against the strange lethargy that was trying to overtake me. The church was so close now that I could make out individual stones in its facade, could see the warm light spilling from its stained glass windows. But the cold was spreading through my body, making each step harder than the last. That's when I heard the bells. They started as a single chime, deep and resonant, echoing off the buildings around me. Then another and another, until the entire night was filled with their bronze voices calling across the darkness. The sound seemed to cut through the cold that had been creeping through my body, warming me from the inside out. Behind me, I heard something that might have been a scream, a sound like wind through broken glass, full of rage and disappointment. The headlights faltered, flickering like candle flames in a hurricane, and the engine sound began to fade. I stumbled up the steps of St. Mary's Cathedral and collapsed against its heavy wooden doors, my chest heaving with exhaustion. When I turned around, the street was empty. No car, no headlights, no pale faces pressed against windows. Just the normal night sounds of a sleeping city and the fading echo of the cathedral bells. I sat there for a long time, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal and trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and called a cab to take me back to campus. When the driver asked why I was at the church so late, I told him I'd gotten lost walking home from the store. It wasn't until I was back in my dorm room, safe under familiar fluorescent lights, that I allowed myself to consider the possibility that what I'd experienced might have been real. I spent the rest of the night researching local history, digging through old newspaper archives and accident reports. I found it buried in a 1967 issue of the local paper, a brief article about a multi-car accident that had occurred on the same streets I'd been walking. 6 people had died when their car ran a red light and collided with oncoming traffic. The article mentioned that the driver had been speeding, trying to make it to Sunday evening service at St. Mary's Cathedral. According to the report, all 6 victims had been found still sitting in their seats, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and desperation. The investigating officer was quoted as saying it looked like they had died trying to reach something just beyond their grasp. But that was almost 60 years ago. The people in that car would all be dead by now anyway, even if they had survived the accident, and cars couldn't drive through people or pass through solid objects. It was impossible. Except I could still feel the cold spot where the vehicle had passed through me, a lingering chill that seemed to have settled permanently in my bones. And sometimes late at night when I'm walking home from the library, I catch glimpses of dim headlights in my peripheral vision, maintaining their patient distance, waiting for me to take a wrong turn down a dark street far from the sound of church bells. I've started taking different routes home now, sticking to well-lit main streets and avoiding the residential neighborhoods where the streetlights seem dimmer and the shadows deeper. I tell myself it's just precaution, that what happened that night was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But I've also downloaded a church bell app on my phone, just in case. Because sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I remember the faces in that car more clearly than I want to. And I understand that they weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to save me from spending eternity alone, in an endless loop of that same dark journey, trapped forever in the moment between one destination and the next. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether what I experienced was real or imagined. The question is whether those pale faces were showing me my future, or whether they were trying to warn me that it had already begun. Story 3. And the fluorescent lights hummed their dying song above the deserted train platform, casting sickly yellow pools across cracked concrete. My backpack straps cut into my shoulders as I checked the departures board for the third time, 11:47 p.m., and my connecting train wouldn't arrive for another 43 minutes. The October air bit through my jacket, carrying the metallic taste of approaching rain and something else, something that made my nostrils flare with unease. 3 other passengers waited in the shadows between the overhead lights, but they might as well have been mannequins for all the life they showed. A woman in a business suit stared at her phone's glow, thumbs motionless. An elderly man clutched a newspaper against his chest like armor. A teenager in oversized headphones swayed to music only he could hear, or perhaps to something else entirely. The platform stretched in both directions, disappearing into tunnels that yawned like open mouths. Between them, cutting beneath the tracks, a pedestrian underpass offered passage to the other side of the station. Its entrance gaped wide, bordered by chipped yellow tiles that reminded me of teeth in need of dental work. The sign above it flickered intermittently. Pedestrian tunnel, 24-hour access. I'd used underpasses like this before, in a dozen different cities during my wandering years. They were practical things, utilitarian spaces that connected point A to point B with minimal fuss. But something about this one felt different, as if the darkness inside possessed weight and intention. The woman with the phone suddenly looked up, her eyes finding mine across the platform. For a moment I thought she might speak, might break the oppressive silence that had settled over us like a burial shroud. Instead, she gathered her things and hurried toward the exit stairs, her heels clicking in urgent staccato against the concrete. The sound echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once before fading into the underground depths. That left 3 of us, or 4 if I counted the presence I couldn't quite locate, something that made the hair on my neck stand at attention, and my peripheral vision swim with movement that vanished when I turned to look. A train horn wailed in the distance, but not the horn of my train. This sound came from deep underground, from tunnels that shouldn't exist beneath the pedestrian passage. The elderly man folded his newspaper and shuffled toward the exit, following the businesswoman's escape route. His footsteps, too, seemed to multiply in the air, creating a symphony of retreating age that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. Now only the teenager and I remained, separated by 60 feet of empty platform and a silence that had grown teeth. His music leaked from his headphones, a thin stream of electronic beats that seemed to stutter and skip, as if the sound itself were limping. He bobbed his head to rhythms that didn't match what I could hear, and I wondered if he was listening to the same thing that had driven the others away. My bladder pressed against my ribs, demanding attention. The restrooms were on the other side of the tracks, accessible only through the pedestrian tunnel. I could wait, should wait, but the discomfort grew with each passing minute, and the alternative, relief behind some shadowy corner of this platform, held even less appeal. I adjusted my backpack and approached the tunnel entrance. The temperature dropped by several degrees as I neared the mouth, and my breath began to mist despite the relative warmth of the October night. The tiles that lined the entrance were older than I'd initially thought, their yellow surface stained with decades of urban grime and something darker that might have been rust, or might have been something else entirely. The fluorescent lights inside the tunnel flickered with the same irregular rhythm as the sign above, creating a strobe effect that made the passageway appear to pulse like a living thing. I stepped across the threshold, and the sounds of the platform, the distant hum of traffic, the electrical buzz of the lighting, even the teenagers' bleeding music, cut off as if I'd entered a soundproof chamber. My footsteps rang against the tiled walls, each step creating a brief percussion that seemed to last longer than it should, stretching into echoes that didn't follow the laws of physics I remembered from high school. The sound bounced off surfaces that appeared smooth, but somehow created complex reverberations, as if the tunnel contained hidden chambers and alcoves that my eyes couldn't detect. Halfway through the passage, I encountered him. He stood with his back pressed against the left wall, a figure draped in shadows that seemed too dark for the sporadic lighting. At first, I thought he might be injured or homeless, someone seeking shelter in this underground space. But as I drew closer, his voice reached me, a low murmur that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves rather than from his throat. The words were indistinct at first, a continuous stream of syllables that rode the strange acoustics of the tunnel like smoke through water. But as I moved within 10 feet of him, the meaning became clear, and I understood why the other passengers had fled. He spoke obscenities, but not random curses or angry outbursts. These were calculated blasphemies, structured verbal assaults that targeted things I held sacred: my mother's memory, my few achievements, my private shames. Somehow, impossibly, he knew details about my life that no stranger should possess. He described my childhood bedroom with perfect accuracy, complete with the hidden compartment where I'd stored my most embarrassing secrets. He recited conversations I'd had with lovers, friends, family members, conversations that had taken place in private rooms, hundreds of miles from this tunnel. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't what he said, but how he said it. His voice emerged from multiple points along the tunnel walls, creating a stereophonic effect that made his words seem to surround me. When he mentioned my ex-girlfriend's name, the sound came from behind me. When he described my father's disappointment in my life choices, the words whispered from the ceiling. Each obscenity found a different acoustic sweet spot, as if the tunnel itself were calibrated to amplify maximum psychological damage. I tried to focus on my destination, the restrooms that waited somewhere ahead in the darkness. But his voice followed me, gained strength, began to overlap with itself in impossible ways. Single words stretched into multiple syllables that came from different directions, creating a call and response pattern with echoes that shouldn't exist. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. Hidden speakers, some kind of psychological experiment, an elaborate prank designed to terrorize late-night travelers. But rationality felt thin in this place, as insubstantial as the fluorescent light that continued to stutter and fade. My throat began to itch. The sensation started as a mild irritation, the kind that usually preceded a cough or clearing of the throat, but it grew more insistent with each step I took deeper into the tunnel, becoming a burning need to respond to his verbal assault. Words formed in my mouth, sarcastic comebacks and angry retorts that demanded release. My tongue moved against my teeth, shaping syllables that wanted desperately to emerge. But something else moved through my consciousness, a warning that felt both external and deeply internal. Don't speak, don't respond, don't give him what he wants. The man's murmuring intensified, and I could see his silhouette more clearly now. He was ordinary in every way: medium height, unremarkable clothing, features that would disappear in any crowd. But his mouth moved with mechanical precision, like a ventriloquist's dummy operated by invisible hands. And his eyes, when they caught the stuttering fluorescent light, reflected nothing at all. I pressed my lips together and increased my pace, but the tunnel seemed to stretch ahead of me, extending far beyond its original length. The restroom sign that should have appeared by now remained absent, replaced by more yellow tiles and more shadows that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. His words grew more specific, more targeted. He described dreams I'd never told anyone about, fears I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten them myself. He spoke about the nightmares that had plagued my childhood, complete with details I was certain I'd never shared with another human being. The sound came from everywhere now: the floor beneath my feet, the ceiling above my head, the spaces between the tiles where no speaker could possibly hide. My throat burned with the need to respond, to defend myself against accusations that cut too close to truths I'd spent years avoiding. The words pressed against my lips like physical things, demanding release, promising relief if I would just open my mouth and let them out. But each time I came close to speaking, something held me back. Not willpower or conscious decision, but something deeper, more primal. The same instinct that might keep a small animal frozen in the presence of a predator. The wisdom of prey that understands silence equals survival. The man's voice began to change, taking on qualities that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. It developed harmonics, overtones that suggested multiple speakers sharing the same throat. When he said my name, and he did know my name, though I was certain we'd never met, the sound came in three-part harmony, each voice slightly out of sync with the others. The tunnel walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with his words, expanding and contracting like the inside of some vast respiratory system. The tiles shifted subtly, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating new patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. My burning throat demanded satisfaction, but I kept my mouth clamped shut and focused on moving forward, one step after another through this nightmare corridor that had somehow become longer than the distance between two train platforms should allow. The man behind me, or beside me, or above me, since his voice now came from all directions, began to repeat himself, but the repetitions weren't exact. Each iteration grew slightly longer, more elaborate, as if his words were feeding on themselves, growing stronger through repetition. What had started as simple curses evolved into complex verbal constructions that seemed designed to burrow into my brain and take up permanent residence. My vision began to blur at the edges, not from tears, but from some other fluid that my eyes produced in response to whatever psychic assault I was experiencing. The fluorescent lights overhead developed halos, rainbow coronas that suggested I was looking at them through water or thick glass. And still the voice continued, now describing things that hadn't happened yet, future humiliations and failures that felt more like prophecies than threats. He spoke of my death, not violent or sudden, but slow and lonely, surrounded by strangers in some sterile institution where my name would be mispronounced on medical charts. He described the decay of my body with scientific precision, the exact sequence of organ failures that would claim me decades from now. But even as he painted these morbid pictures, I realized something that chilled me more than his words. I was beginning to understand how the tunnel worked, how this place operated on principles that had nothing to do with normal acoustics or psychology. This wasn't a man speaking at all, not anymore. This was something else, something that had learned to use human vocal patterns to achieve purposes no human mind could comprehend. The tunnel served as an amplification chamber, a resonance cavity that took spoken malice and transformed it into something with physical weight and psychological gravity. And the burning in my throat wasn't just irritation or the urge to respond. It was contamination, the early stage of whatever process had transformed the man against the wall into a conduit for this place's hunger. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange clarity. I understood now why silence was crucial, why speaking would be not just dangerous but potentially irreversible. Words spoken in this place didn't just echo, they evolved, mutated, took on lives of their own that sought new hosts, new throats through which to perpetuate their existence. The tunnel finally began to show signs of ending. A square of lesser darkness appeared ahead, marking the exit that would return me to the relative sanity of fluorescent lights and concrete platforms. But as I approached it, the voice behind me grew more desperate, more insistent. It pleaded with me to respond, to engage, to validate its existence through acknowledgement. My throat felt raw now, as if I'd been shouting for hours. Saliva had turned thick and bitter in my mouth, carrying flavors of copper and something organic that made my stomach revolt. But I kept walking, kept my lips pressed together, kept my silence intact despite the growing pressure that felt like it might split my skull. The exit grew larger, and with it came the first sounds from the outside world. Distant traffic, the hum of electrical systems, the normal urban symphony that had been completely absent from the tunnel's interior. These ordinary sounds felt like lifelines thrown to a drowning man, proof that reality still existed beyond this acoustic nightmare. 3 steps from the exit, the voice behind me screamed. It was a sound no human throat could produce, a harmonic convergence of rage and hunger that seemed to shake the tunnel's very foundation. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the fluorescent lights exploded in sequence, showering me with sparks and fragments of glass that somehow never touched my skin. But I was already stepping into the outside air, already crossing the threshold back into a world where echoes followed predictable patterns and voices came from identifiable sources. The scream cut off abruptly, as if a door had slammed shut behind me, leaving only the ordinary sounds of the train station and the approaching rumble of my connection. I stood in the relative brightness of the opposite platform, my legs shaking with adrenaline and relief. The restrooms waited 20 feet away, but I found I no longer needed them. Fear had apparently solved that particular problem. Behind me, the tunnel mouth gaped in innocent darkness, showing no signs of the acoustic horror I'd just experienced. A few tiles were missing from the entrance archway. They might have been missing for years, or they might have fallen moments ago when that impossible scream shook the structure. I couldn't tell, and I didn't particularly want to investigate. My train arrived 7 minutes later, and I climbed aboard with the urgency of someone fleeing a burning building. Only when the doors closed and the car began to move did I allow myself to relax, to feel safe enough to examine what had happened. But even as the tunnel disappeared behind me, even as the station faded into the distance, I could feel something lodged in my throat like a splinter. Not painful exactly, but present, foreign, waiting. Sometimes, when I wasn't paying attention, I caught myself murmuring under my breath, forming words I didn't recognize in languages I'd never learned. And sometimes, late at night when the world grew quiet, I could swear I heard echoes of that tunnel voice calling to me across the darkness, promising that our conversation wasn't finished, that silence was only a temporary reprieve. The burning in my throat never completely went away. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in another train station, in another city, watching another late-night traveler approach a pedestrian tunnel that looked remarkably similar to the one I'd escaped. I wanted to warn him, to tell him about the dangers that waited in places where sound behaved according to rules older than human understanding. But when I opened my mouth to call out, the words that emerged weren't mine. They echoed strangely in the vast space of the station, bouncing off surfaces with patterns that defied architectural logic, growing stronger with each repetition, searching for new throats, new hosts, new voices to carry them forward into the endless night. The traveler paused at the tunnel entrance, as if he'd heard something that made his survival instincts prick with alarm. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, might choose a longer route that avoided the acoustic trap waiting in the darkness. Instead, he adjusted his backpack and stepped across the threshold, disappearing into the hungry shadows, while my borrowed voice continued to call after him, offering obscenities and revelations in equal measure, painting pictures of his private shames with impossible accuracy, and somewhere in the darkness of my throat, something that wasn't quite me anymore smiled with satisfaction. Already composing the words it would whisper to the next traveler, and the next, and all the others who would follow them into tunnels where echoes had learned to live independent lives. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, spreading from throat to throat through the vast network of underground passages that connected every city, every station, every place where human voices gathered to share their darkest truths with walls that had learned to listen and remember and repeat. Story 4. The scraping started at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling of my new studio apartment, counting the water stains that resembled faces in the dim light filtering through the thin curtains. The building was supposed to be quiet. That's what the landlord had promised when I signed the lease. Perfect for creative types, he'd said with a yellowed smile that should have been my first warning. The sound came from directly above, a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, followed by what I could only describe as painting. Long, deliberate strokes that seemed to echo through the walls themselves. I pressed my ear to the ceiling, and the noise became more distinct, metal scraping against plaster, then the wet sound of a brush loaded with paint. By morning, dark circles had formed under my eyes like bruises. I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, noting how the hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should, and knocked on apartment 2B. The woman who answered was perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the corners of her pale eyes. She wore a paint-stained smock over what looked like a nightgown, even though it was nearly noon. When I mentioned the noise, she tilted her head with the curious expression of someone hearing a foreign language. Her response came slowly, as if translated from another tongue. She painted religious symbols for protection, she explained, and the work required darkness to be effective. The shadows were important, she said. They helped her see the angles properly. I returned to my studio more unsettled than when I'd left. That evening, I positioned myself near the ceiling with a glass pressed against the plaster, trying to decipher the pattern of sounds above. The scraping had rhythm, 3 short scratches, 1 long drag, pause, repeat. Between these intervals came the brushwork, accompanied by something that sounded almost like whispered counting. The third night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I climbed the stairs again, but this time I didn't knock. The door to 2B was slightly ajar, which struck me as odd given how carefully she'd answered my knock before. Through the gap, I could see nothing but blackness, not the dim darkness of a poorly lit room, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The apartment was a mirror image of mine, but where mine had windows, walls, and furniture, hers had mirrors. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor, was covered in mismatched mirrors of various shapes and sizes. But these weren't ordinary mirrors. Each one faced inward, toward the center of the room, and instead of reflecting light or images, they showed only darkness. It was as if they reflected not what was, but what wasn't. She stood in the center of this mirrored maze, painting symbols on the one remaining section of exposed wall. Up close, I could see they weren't crucifixes as I'd assumed, but something more complex. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for my eyes to process comfortably. When she noticed me, she didn't seem surprised. She simply continued painting while explaining, in that same slow, translated voice, that the mirrors helped her work. They showed her the spaces between things, the gaps where her echo demons lived. She'd been preparing this room for months, aligning each mirror to create the proper angles. Soon, she said, they would be able to manifest completely. I backed toward the door, but she stopped me with a raised hand. There was one mirror missing, she explained. The hallway mirror, the large one mounted between our doors. If that mirror were to break, or even crack, it would complete the circuit. The reflections would align perfectly, and her echo demons would have a clear path into our reality. Once that happened, everyone on this floor would be trapped in their own personal labyrinth of internal mirrors, seeing only what the demons wanted them to see. I fled. Back in my studio, I tried to rationalize what I'd witnessed. The woman was clearly disturbed, possibly suffering from some form of psychosis involving mirrors and religious imagery. The echo demons were obviously delusions, and her apartment was likely just an elaborate manifestation of mental illness. The mirrors probably reflected darkness because they were positioned at odd angles, or perhaps covered with some kind of film. But as the days passed, I began to notice things. The hallway mirror, which I'd never paid attention to before, seemed to watch me. When I passed by, my reflection appeared normal, but I could swear I saw movement in the periphery, shapes that shifted just outside my direct line of sight. Sometimes, when I approached from a certain angle, the mirror showed not just my reflection, but hints of other images, geometric patterns that reminded me of the symbols I'd seen her painting, angles that folded in on themselves impossibly. The scraping sounds above continued, but now I could hear them during the day as well. More disturbing was the realization that the sounds weren't just coming from above. They seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, as if the entire building had become resonant chamber for whatever she was doing up there. I started avoiding the hallway mirror, taking the stairs 2 at a time and keeping my eyes down. But even then, I could feel it pulling at my peripheral vision, demanding attention. When I finally gathered the courage to look directly at it, I understood why. The mirror was developing cracks. They were small at first, hairline fractures that spread outward from the center like a spider web. Each day they grew more pronounced, and with each new crack, the strange reflections became more vivid. I could see them clearly now, vast geometric spaces that seemed to exist behind the glass, populated by shadows that moved with purpose and intelligence. I researched the building's history and discovered that 2B had been vacant for nearly 6 months before my neighbor moved in. The previous tenant had been found wandering the streets, speaking incoherently about mirrors and angles. He'd been committed to a psychiatric facility where he remained, drawing complex geometric patterns on any surface he could find, and insisting that something was watching him through the walls. The night the mirror finally broke, I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the hallway with a baseball bat, determined to destroy the mirror before it could complete whatever circuit my neighbor believed it would create. But when the final crack spread across its surface with a sound like breaking bones, I found myself unable to move. The mirror didn't shatter. It simply ceased to reflect anything recognizable. Instead, it became a window into that geometric space I'd glimpsed in fragments, and through that window I could see them. They weren't demons in any classical sense. They were something far stranger, entities that existed in the spaces between reflections, feeding on the light that bounced endlessly between mirrors. They had no fixed form, appearing instead as shifting patterns of shadow and angle that hurt to perceive directly. But I could feel their attention, cold and hungry and patient. My neighbor emerged from her apartment, and I noticed for the first time that her eyes reflected that same dark emptiness as her mirrors. She approached the broken mirror with reverent steps and placed her palm against its surface. The glass rippled like water at her touch. That's when I understood. She wasn't trying to summon these entities. She'd been consumed by them long ago. The woman I'd been speaking to was just an echo, a reflection of someone who no longer existed in any meaningful way. The real person had been trapped in that labyrinth of internal mirrors she'd spoken of, leaving behind only this hollow duplicate to complete the work. I tried to run, but the hallway had changed. It stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with mirrors that showed not my reflection but theirs, countless versions of myself trapped in geometric prisons, each one trying desperately to escape while echo demons fed on their terror. The last thing I remember clearly is the sound of my own voice, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere, counting in that same slow, translated rhythm I'd heard from above. 3 short scratches, 1 long drag, pause, repeat. Now I sit in my studio, writing this account, though I can't be certain whether I'm the original or just another echo. The mirrors my neighbor installed have appeared in my apartment as well. I don't remember bringing them in, but they line my walls now, facing inward, showing me nothing but darkness. Sometimes I catch myself painting symbols on the walls in the middle of the night, though I have no memory of learning these patterns. My neighbors below have started complaining about the noise, but when I try to explain about the echo demons and the mirrors, they look at me with the same expression I must have given my upstairs neighbor. The scraping continues above, even though I know apartment 2B is empty now. The landlord showed it to prospective tenants just yesterday, describing it as perfect for creative types, with that same yellowed smile. The new tenant will move in next week, and I should probably warn them about the sounds at night. But I find myself wondering, which one of us is real? Which one is just an echo, trapped in a labyrinth of internal mirrors, painting warnings that no one will heed? The mirror in my hallway has developed new cracks, spreading outward like a spider web. Through the fractures, I can see spaces that fold in on themselves, populated by shadows that move with purpose and intelligence. They're watching me write this, these echo demons, feeding on the light that bounces endlessly between the mirrors. And sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection counting along with their rhythm. 3 short scratches, 1 long drag, pause, repeat. I think I understand now why the previous tenant drew those patterns in his psychiatric ward. They're not symbols of protection. They're maps showing the way through the labyrinth. But the question remains, are they maps leading in or leading out? The scraping has stopped. In the sudden silence, I can hear something new. Footsteps in the hallway, approaching my door. But when I look through the peephole, I see only my own face staring back. Mouth moving in that slow, translated rhythm. Eyes reflecting nothing but darkness. The echo demons have found their perfect angle at last. Story 5. The floorboards above my head groaned with deliberate weight. I jerked awake in the narrow bed, my sketching hand still cramped around the charcoal pencil I'd fallen asleep clutching. The recovery hadn't been going well. 3 weeks in this rented farmhouse outside Millau, and my mind still felt fractured, unable to focus on anything but the simplest line drawings. The doctor had prescribed rest, isolation, time to heal from what the insurance forms diplomatically called a creative breakdown. Another footstep, then another. The ceiling timbers protested with each measured pace, dust motes dancing in the pale morning light filtering through the gauze curtains. Someone was walking across the upper floor of a house that supposedly had no upper floor accessible from the inside. When I'd first arrived, the elderly caretaker had mentioned the old grain loft in halting English, gesturing vaguely upward before adding that the interior stairs had been removed decades ago. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. The footsteps continued their deliberate circuit, heel, toe, following what seemed to be the perimeter of the room above. Measuring, searching. The walking stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of other sounds. Rain beginning to patter against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the valley. Another storm approaching. They'd been frequent lately, violent affairs that turned the pastoral countryside into something primordial and threatening. I forced myself to stand, bare feet meeting the cold stone floor. My easel stood nearby, yesterday's unfinished sketch still clipped to it. A simple drawing of the kitchen window that had somehow become distorted in the making, the proportions subtly wrong, as if viewed through water or fever dreams. My hand had been shaking more lately, the medications making everything feel distant and unreal. The front door stood open. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't heard anyone enter or leave. But there it was, morning mist drifting across the threshold like smoke, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and something else. Something organic and unsettling, like mushrooms growing in dark places. Muddy footprints tracked across the stone floor, each print distinct and deliberate. They were large, larger than my own, with an odd, elongated quality that made me think of webbed feet or fingers. The prints led from the open door across the main room and toward the narrow passage that connected the house to the old grain silo. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, fingers sliding on the wet iron handle. Outside, the storm was building. Dark clouds roiled overhead, pregnant with violence. The air felt charged, electric, making my skin crawl, and the hair on my arms stand upright. I should have closed the door, should have called the caretaker or the police or anyone. Instead, I found myself following the muddy trail, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The passage to the silo was narrow, carved from the same gray stone as the house. The walls seemed to press inward as I walked, and my breathing became shallow, labored. The footprints continued ahead of me, growing fresher, the mud darker and more viscous. The silo's wooden door hung slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see darkness that seemed to move and breathe. The air that drifted out carried that same earthy organic smell, now stronger, accompanied by something else. A sound like distant wind, or perhaps very quiet breathing. I pushed the door open wider. The interior of the silo stretched upward into shadows, the old grain chutes and support beams creating a maze of geometric darkness. But it was the floor that held my attention. The stone was covered in a network of what looked like dark veins or roots, spreading outward from a central point where the muddy footprints ended. And there, in the center of that organic web, something waited. At first, I thought it was just a trick of shadow and perspective, but as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a form, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. It stood perfectly still, facing away from me, but I had the unmistakable sensation that it was aware of my presence. The storm broke overhead with a crack of thunder that shook the entire structure. Rain began to hammer against the silo's roof, and as it did, the figure began to change. What I had taken for shadow seemed to gain substance, becoming more solid, more real. The dark veins on the floor pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and the temperature in the small space began to drop. I backed toward the door, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. The cold was spreading through me, not the clean cold of winter air, but something deeper, more invasive. It felt like being drained, like something was pulling the warmth from my bones. The figure turned. Where its face should have been, there was only a suggestion of features, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human head from fog and rain. But the eyes, if they were eyes, seemed to glow with their own pale light, and when they fixed on me, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, as if my heart had forgotten how to beat properly. It began to move toward me with that same deliberate gait I'd heard overhead, each step causing the dark veins on the floor to pulse brighter. The cold intensified, and I realized with growing horror that I could see my breath, could feel ice crystals forming on my eyelashes. I ran. Back through the passage, stumbling and gasping, the sound of rain growing louder with each step. Behind me, I could hear something following. Not footsteps now, but a sound like wind through leaves, or perhaps the whisper of fabric against stone. I slammed the front door behind me and threw the heavy iron bolt. Then I ran to the kitchen, searching frantically through the drawers, until I found the box of matches I'd seen the day before. My hands shook so badly I could barely light one, but finally managed to get the old gas heater working. Heat flooded the small room, and I pressed myself against the radiator, desperate to drive away the cold that seemed to have settled in my bones. But even as warmth returned to my fingers and toes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The footsteps returned overhead. This time, they were different, more urgent, more persistent. They followed the same circuit as before, but faster now, with an agitated quality that made my skin crawl. Whatever was up there seemed angry, frustrated. Then I understood. The heat. It wanted the heat. I looked around the kitchen, taking inventory. The gas heater, the electric stove, the small space heater in the corner, all sources of warmth, all things that made the old farmhouse livable during the cold, wet spring, and all things I would have to turn off if I wanted to survive. The realization hit me like cold water. The creature, entity, whatever it was, fed on heat, on warmth. The story the caretaker had told me about the old silo suddenly made sense. He'd mentioned something about the strange weather patterns, about how storms seemed to linger around the property longer than they should, about previous tenants who had left suddenly, without explanation. I turned off the heater. The warmth began to ebb immediately, and with it came that invasive cold, seeping through the walls like water through a sponge. The footsteps overhead grew more frantic, more demanding. Something was scratching at the walls now, a sound like fingernails on wood. I wrapped myself in every blanket I could find, but it wasn't enough. The cold continued to spread, and I began to understand that this wasn't just about temperature. Whatever was happening to me was happening on a deeper level, as if the very essence of warmth was being drawn out of my body. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed distorted, unreliable. The storm raged outside with unnatural persistence, rain hammering against the windows with such force that I began to wonder if the glass would hold. The scratching sounds grew louder, more insistent, and I could swear I heard breathing in the walls themselves. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I found myself struggling to stay conscious. The cold was winning, slowly, but inevitably. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, my thoughts becoming sluggish and disjointed. That's when I noticed my sketch pad. It lay open on the table where I'd left it, but the drawings had changed. The simple kitchen window I'd been working on yesterday was now crowded with additional details I didn't remember adding. Extra lines suggested movement in the glass, faces in the shadows, hands pressed against the panes from the outside. And there, in the corner of the page, was a figure I definitely hadn't drawn. Tall, impossibly thin, with eyes that seemed to follow me even from the flat surface of the paper. I flipped through the other pages with numb fingers. More drawings I didn't remember making, all showing the same elongated figure in various poses around the property, standing in the passage, crouched on the roof, pressed against the windows, looking in. The final drawing showed the interior of the silo, but from an impossible angle, as if viewed from above. And there, in the center of the dark web, was a second figure, smaller, more human. It was me. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard only the rain and my own labored breathing. Then, very quietly, came the sound of the front door opening. No footsteps this time, just the gradual awareness that something was moving through the house, bringing with it a cold so intense that frost began to form on the inside of the windows. I huddled deeper into my blankets, but they offered no protection against this invasive chill. My teeth chattered so violently, I was afraid I might bite my tongue. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to gain weight and substance. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the others, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on me. The temperature dropped another degree, then another. The shadow began to move closer. As it approached, I could make out more details, the suggestion of limbs, of a head turned in my direction, of fingers that seemed to stretch and bend like smoke. And those eyes, pale and luminous, fixed on me with an intensity that made my vision swim. It reached out toward me, and I felt the last of my body heat being pulled away, drawn into that impossible form like iron filings to a magnet. My heartbeat stuttered, skipped, nearly stopped. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rain ceased. The silence was absolute, profound. The shadow froze mid-reach, its pale eyes flickering like candles in a draught. For a moment, we remained locked in that tableau, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Then the first ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. The shadow recoiled as if burned, retreating toward the darker corners of the room. The invasive cold began to recede, and I felt warmth returning to my extremities, my vision clearing. The entity faded like morning mist, becoming translucent, then invisible, until only the memory of those pale eyes remained. I sat in the growing daylight, shivering despite the returning warmth, and stared at my sketch pad. The drawings were still there, all of them, including the one showing me in the center of the dark web. But now there was something else, a new detail I was certain hadn't been there before. In the margin of the final drawing, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were two words: until tomorrow. Outside, storm clouds were already beginning to gather on the horizon. I should leave. Should pack my things and drive back to the city, back to specialists and medications and the safety of rational explanations. The doctor had warned me about hallucinations, about the way trauma could manifest in seemingly real sensory experiences. But as I looked at those drawings, at the impossible detail and consistency of my supposed delusions, I found myself wondering which was more frightening: the possibility that the storm dweller was real, or the possibility that my mind was so thoroughly broken that it could create such elaborate and persistent fantasies. The footsteps returned overhead, lighter now, almost playful. I closed the sketch pad and went to relight the heater, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. Whatever was happening to me, supernatural encounter or psychological breakdown, I was no longer running from it. Tomorrow night, when the storms returned, I would be ready. After all, what's the difference between madness and revelation when you're the only witness to either? Story 6. The beer still tasted metallic on my tongue when I fumbled with the keys outside my apartment door. 3 pints at the Scholar's Rest had been enough to blur the edges of another failed midterm, but not enough to drown the anxiety that gnawed at my chest like a persistent cough. The hallway smelled of old carpet and someone's microwave dinner, a comforting mundaneness that I didn't know I'd soon miss. I pushed the door open and immediately noticed the silhouette on my couch. My roommate Jake must have crashed early, probably exhausted from his engineering lab again. The figure lay motionless, curled on its side facing away from me, covered by what looked like my old gray blanket. I could barely make out the dark outline against the pale upholstery and the dim light spilling from the street lamp outside. I considered saying something, but the apartment felt heavy with sleep, and my head still buzzed with alcohol and fatigue. Instead, I kicked off my shoes and padded quietly toward my bedroom, grateful that someone else was dealing with the loneliness of Thursday night better than I was. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a sound I'd grown accustomed to after 8 months in this run-down student housing. But tonight, each groan of the wood seemed amplified, echoing through the silence like a warning. I paused outside my bedroom door and glanced back at the couch. The figure hadn't moved. Something nagged at me. Jake's breathing. I couldn't hear it. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the ambient sounds of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of a television from the apartment below, the occasional car passing on the street. But from the couch, nothing. Not even the whisper of fabric shifting with breath. The alcohol made my thoughts sluggish, but unease prickled along my spine like ice water. I took a step back toward the living room, squinting in the darkness. The shape on the couch remained perfectly still, unnaturally so. When people sleep, they move. Subtle shifts, the rise and fall of breath, the unconscious adjustments that come with dreaming. This figure possessed the absolute stillness of an object. I reached for the wall switch, my hand trembling slightly. The sudden flood of light made me blink, and when my vision cleared, I found myself staring at an empty couch. The gray blanket lay crumpled exactly where I'd seen the sleeping form, still holding the suggestion of a human shape in its folds. My heart stuttered. I swept my gaze across the small living room, the kitchenette, the bathroom door, the closet. Nothing. No one. The apartment felt hollow, as if it had been empty for hours. I must have imagined it. The beer, the stress, the exhaustion, they'd conspired to create a shadow where none existed. I'd heard about college students hallucinating from sleep deprivation and substance use. It happened all the time. I tried to convince myself as I turned off the light and retreated to my bedroom, but my hands still shook as I closed the door behind me. I changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt, brushing my teeth in the small mirror above my dresser. My reflection looked pale, eyes ringed with dark circles. I'd been pushing too hard, staying up too late, drinking too much. The semester was getting to me more than I'd admitted, but as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the memory of that absolute stillness. The way the figure had seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The sensation that I was looking at something that shouldn't have been there. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around me. The heating system clicked on with a mechanical wheeze. Footsteps moved across the floor above. My upstairs neighbor heading to bed. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath my bedroom door. Not knocking exactly, but a gentle percussion, like fingertips drumming against wood. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. Jake must have come home while I was getting ready for bed. Maybe he was trying to get my attention without waking me, thinking I was already asleep. But the tapping continued with mechanical precision, too regular to be human. No one maintained that exact rhythm for so long. It reminded me of a metronome, each sequence identical to the last. I slipped out of bed and approached the door, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The tapping stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the sound had heard me moving. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. Nothing. The silence stretched on, thick and expectant. I reached for the doorknob, then hesitated. Something about the sudden cessation of sound felt wrong, like a predator freezing when it realizes it's been detected. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The living room beyond lay in darkness, undisturbed. No sign of Jake or anyone else. I flicked on the hall light and checked his bedroom, still empty, bed unslept in. I was alone in the apartment. I had been alone the entire time. The realization hit me like cold water. Whatever I'd heard, whatever I'd seen on the couch, it existed only in my head. The stress was getting worse than I'd thought. I needed to see someone, maybe the counseling center on campus. This wasn't normal. I turned to go back to my room and froze. There, at the base of my bedroom door, a thin shadow stretched across the threshold. Not my shadow. I was standing to the side, and the hallway light cast my silhouette in a completely different direction. This shadow was long and narrow, with what looked like extended fingers reaching into my room. I stepped sideways. The shadow didn't move. I waved my hand. The shadow remained perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The shadow wasn't just dark. It was an absolute void, blacker than the absence of light should have been, and those finger-like projections were too long, too thin, stretching impossibly far into my room. I knelt down, my heart hammering, and reached toward the shadow. My hand passed through empty air. There was nothing there, no obstruction, no object casting the shadow, just the visual impression of darkness against the floor. I backed away, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. A trick of the light, a stain on the floor I'd never noticed, some optical illusion created by the angle of the hallway fixture. But even as I told myself these things, I could see the shadow more clearly. It had depth, texture, as if it were made of something denser than ordinary darkness. I turned off the hallway light and hurried back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. In the darkness, I fumbled for my desk lamp and switched it on. The warm circle of light felt like a protective barrier, pushing back the oppressive darkness that seemed to press against the windows. But even with the light on, I couldn't shake the image of those impossibly long fingers stretching under my door. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone to call. Anyone who might still be awake, who could talk me through whatever breakdown I was having. That's when I noticed the shadow under my door had returned. Even with my desk lamp on, even with light spilling across the floor, the dark shape stretched into my room. This time I could see it more clearly. Not just fingers, but what looked like an entire arm, elongated and distorted, reaching toward my bed. I pointed my phone's flashlight at the door. The beam passed right through the space where the shadow appeared to be, revealing only empty floor. But I could still see it, superimposed over reality like a double exposure, darker than anything around it. My hands shook as I dialed Jake's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried my friend Marcus from biology class. No answer. The isolation felt suffocating, as if the apartment had been cut off from the rest of the world. I set the phone down and stared at the shadow. As I watched, it began to move. Not quickly, but with deliberate purpose, the dark shape spread further into my room. The fingers, or what my mind interpreted as fingers, extended toward the foot of my bed. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, but nothing else. No sound accompanied the shadow's movement. I pressed myself against the wall, as far from the door as possible. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Shadows didn't move independently. They didn't exist without objects to cast them. They didn't reach across rooms like living things. But even as I repeated these facts to myself, the shadow continued its inexorable approach. It moved like liquid darkness, flowing across the floor with organic fluidity. When it reached the base of my bed, it paused, as if considering its next move. Then it began to rise. The shadow lifted from the floor, climbing the side of my mattress like smoke given weight. I watched in paralyzed fascination as it took on more definition, developing what looked like shoulders, a torso, the suggestion of a head. It was becoming three-dimensional, gaining substance even as it remained impossibly dark. I scrambled off the bed, nearly tripping over my discarded clothes. The shadow figure continued to rise, now sitting on my mattress exactly where I had been lying moments before. It had no features, no details, just the human-shaped absence of light. But I could feel its attention on me, cold and predatory. My rational mind screamed that this was a hallucination, a symptom of some kind of psychotic break. But my body responded to a deeper, more primitive understanding. Every instinct told me I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist, something that meant me harm. The shadow began to turn toward me. I bolted from the room, not bothering to close the door behind me. In the living room, I fumbled for the main light switch, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent brightness. The normalcy of the illuminated apartment, my textbooks on the coffee table, Jake's jacket hanging on the back of a chair, the dirty dishes in the sink, felt like a lifeline to sanity. I grabbed my phone and called campus security, but even as it rang, I realized how insane I would sound. I hung up before anyone answered and instead opened my laptop, searching for information about hallucinations, sleep deprivation, psychotic episodes. The clinical descriptions matched my symptoms: visual disturbances, paranoia, the sensation of being watched. I was having a breakdown. That was the only logical explanation. But logic felt thin when I turned back toward my bedroom and saw the shadow standing in the doorway. It no longer hugged the floor or walls. It stood upright, roughly my height and build, a perfect silhouette of absolute darkness. Even in the bright living room light, it maintained its impossible blackness, like a hole cut out of reality. We faced each other across the small apartment, predator and prey in a standoff that defied every natural law I understood. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing against my mind. It wasn't just watching me. It was studying me, learning me, preparing to become me. The thought came unbidden, irrational, but with a certainty that terrified me. This thing wanted to replace me, to take my place in the world, to be me while I... What? Faded away? Became the shadow? I backed toward the kitchenette, keeping my eyes on the figure. It didn't move, but I sensed patience in its stillness, the coiled readiness of something waiting for the right moment to strike. My hand found the handle of the largest knife in the dish rack, but I didn't draw it. What good would a weapon do against a shadow? Instead, I reached for the wall switch that controlled the kitchen lights. The moment my fingers touched the switch, the shadow figure moved. It flowed toward me with terrifying speed, covering the distance across the living room in seconds. I slammed my palm against the switch, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and the shadow stopped mid-motion, wavering like smoke in a breeze. The connection hit me like a revelation. Light and shadow, contrast and definition. It needed the boundaries between illumination and darkness to maintain its form. In complete darkness, it lost cohesion. I switched off every light I could reach, throwing the apartment into near total blackness. Only the faint glow from the street lamp outside provided any illumination, and in that dim light, the shadow figure became indistinct, less substantial, but I could still sense it, moving through the darkness with predatory intent. It didn't need eyes to track me. It seemed to follow some other sense, perhaps drawn to the warmth of my body or the rhythm of my breathing. I remembered the small mirror in my bedroom, the one I used for getting ready each morning. It was old, tarnished around the edges, its surface dark enough to reflect shadows instead of light. If this thing was somehow real, if it operated by rules I didn't understand, maybe it could be trapped in its own reflection. I crept through the dark apartment, guided by memory and the faint light from outside. Behind me, I could hear something moving. Not footsteps exactly, but the whisper of presence, the displacement of air that suggested something large and patient following in my wake. In my bedroom, I fumbled for the mirror on my dresser. My hands found the familiar rectangular frame, and I lifted it carefully, turning to face the darkness where I sensed the shadow waiting. At first, I saw nothing in the mirror's surface. Then, gradually, a shape began to resolve in the tarnished glass, darker than the surrounding darkness, more solid than the shadows cast by furniture and walls. The reflection showed the figure clearly, standing just a few feet away, arms slightly outstretched as if reaching for me. I held the mirror steady, angling it to catch the shadow's reflection fully. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure in the mirror began to move, but not in sync with anything in the room. It turned within the glass, looking around as if confused, then pressed against the surface from the inside. The shadow in my room flickered, becoming less distinct. I could feel something pulling at it, drawing it toward the mirror like iron filings to a magnet. The figure struggled, its form wavering between substance and emptiness, but the reflection grew stronger, more defined. With a sensation like air being sucked from the room, the shadow collapsed inward and vanished. The mirror's surface rippled once, like disturbed water, then went still. In the dark glass, I could just make out a shape pressed against the inside of the reflection, a human silhouette trapped in perpetual darkness. I set the mirror face down on my dresser and backed away, my heart still pounding. The apartment felt empty again, normal. Outside, dawn was beginning to creep across the sky, painting the windows with pale light. I called in sick to my morning classes and spent the day researching everything I could find about shadows, reflections, and psychological phenomena. I found articles about mass hysteria, sleep paralysis, and shared delusions. I read about college students cracking under pressure, experiencing episodes that felt real, but existed only in their minds. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that the entire experience had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress, alcohol, and sleep deprivation. Almost. But I kept the mirror face down, and I made sure every light in the apartment was working before night fell. Jake returned that evening, complaining about a weekend trip with his fraternity brothers that had run longer than expected. He seemed normal, concerned about my pale appearance but accepting my explanation about food poisoning. We ordered pizza and watched a movie, and the apartment felt safe again, inhabited by normal sounds and conversations. It wasn't until Jake mentioned the prank that everything shifted back into uncertainty. He laughed about it over dinner, describing how some of his frat brothers had hired what they called a shadow service, some kind of performance art troupe that specialized in elaborate pranks using projection technology and optical illusions. They'd targeted several apartments in our building as part of an initiation challenge, creating the appearance of impossible shadows and shapes to mess with residents' heads. The whole point was to make people question reality, Jake explained, grinning. Some kind of psychological experiment disguised as a prank. Pretty messed up, but you've got to admit it's creative. I listened to his explanation with growing unease. It answered everything: the shadow on the couch, the figure in my room, the impossible movements. It had all been an elaborate illusion, designed to manipulate my perception and exploit my exhaustion. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt only a cold certainty that Jake was lying. His smile was too bright, his explanation too convenient. And when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him glancing at the mirror on my dresser with an expression of puzzled frustration, as if something he expected to find there was missing. That night, I lay awake listening to Jake move around the apartment. His footsteps seemed different, too light, too careful, as if he were still learning how to walk in his own body. When he spoke, his voice carried the right words, but lacked the familiar inflections I'd grown accustomed to over months of shared living. In the morning, I found him standing motionless in the kitchen, staring at his reflection in the toaster's chrome surface. When I spoke his name, he startled and turned to me with an expression of momentary confusion, as if he'd forgotten who he was supposed to be. "Just checking my hair," he said, but his laugh sounded hollow. I moved out of the apartment the following week, claiming family issues that required my immediate attention. Jake didn't seem particularly upset by my departure, accepting my explanations with the same bright, artificial smile. As I packed my belongings, I wrapped the mirror carefully in old towels and placed it at the bottom of my suitcase. I still have it, kept face down in the back of my closet. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint tapping sounds coming from the direction of that closet, a soft, rhythmic percussion that reminds me of fingers drumming against glass. When I unwrap the mirror and look into its dark surface, I can see a shape moving in the depths of the reflection, pressing against the boundaries of its prison. But I'm never sure if the trapped figure is the shadow that invaded my apartment, or if it's me, the real me, locked away while something else wears my face and lives my life. The uncertainty gnaws at me, growing stronger each day as I notice small changes in my own behavior, moments of confusion about my own identity. Jake still texts me occasionally, casual messages about classes and weekend plans. His words feel authentic, his concern genuine. He sounds more like himself in those messages than he did during my final days in the apartment. Maybe the prank explanation was real. Maybe I did have a breakdown and imagined the entire experience. Maybe the mirror holds nothing but shadows and reflections, and my current fears are just the lingering effects of a trauma that existed only in my mind. But late at night, when I catch my reflection in bathroom mirrors or storefront windows, I sometimes see something that doesn't quite match my movements. A slight delay, a different expression, as if the reflection is learning to mimic me rather than simply showing what's there. And I remember the absolute stillness of that figure on my couch, the impossible darkness of its form, the patient, predatory intelligence behind its movements. I remember the sensation of being studied, evaluated, and ultimately replaced. The truth, I've come to realize, might be irrelevant. Whether the shadow was real or imagined, whether I'm experiencing supernatural persecution or psychological breakdown, the result is the same. I no longer trust my own perceptions, my own memories, my own identity. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps the most effective way to steal someone's life isn't to replace them with something obviously false, but to make them question whether they were ever real to begin with. The mirror remains wrapped in my closet, and I tell myself I keep it as evidence, proof of what happened that night. But sometimes I wonder if I'm really the one keeping it, or if something else is making sure it stays close, waiting for the right moment to reverse our positions. After all, shadows are patient things. They can wait in darkness for as long as necessary, growing stronger while the light gradually fades. And every day I feel a little less substantial, a little more like something that might disappear entirely if the light hit me just right. Story 7. The streetlights had surrendered to the creeping dusk hours ago, their yellow halos now weak and sickly against the gathering darkness. I pulled my jacket tighter as I navigated the cracked sidewalks of Riverside District, each step sending small echoes bouncing off the abandoned storefronts that lined the street like broken teeth. The quarterly reports in my backpack seemed heavier with each block, though I knew that was impossible. Numbers on paper couldn't gain weight, no matter how damning the financial projections they contained. I shouldn't have taken this route. The main thoroughfare would have added 20 minutes to my walk home, but at least it had functioning streetlights and the occasional patrol car. Here, in this forgotten corner of the city where urban renewal had come to die, the only witnesses were boarded windows and the occasional rats scurrying between overflowing dumpsters. The air tasted of rust and neglect, with an underlying dampness that seemed to seep up from the cracked asphalt itself. My breath formed small clouds in the increasingly cold air, though the weather report had called for a mild evening. The temperature seemed to be dropping with each step I took deeper into the neighborhood. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, but the screen remained black despite my repeated attempts to wake it. The silence around me felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the better parts of the city and the occasional groan of settling buildings. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I convinced myself it was an echo of my own movement, the sound bouncing strangely off the narrow alley walls. But as I slowed my pace, the rhythm remained constant. Measured, deliberate steps that seemed to splash slightly with each contact against the pavement. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing except the empty street stretching back toward the distant glow of civilization. The footsteps grew closer. I quickened my pace, my analytical mind racing through probabilities and risk assessments the way it did when reviewing market volatility reports. The rational part of my brain cataloged the facts. Abandoned neighborhood, expensive laptop in my bag, probably just an opportunistic criminal. Nothing more than statistics playing out in real time. But something about those approaching footsteps felt wrong in a way that transcended logic. They carried the weight of water, as if each step was fighting against some invisible current. When the voice called out behind me, it carried the hollow quality of sound echoing up from a deep well. "Hey there, friend. Hold up a minute." I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man stood perhaps 10 feet away, though I hadn't heard him close the distance. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging from his frame like they'd been cut for someone with more substantial flesh. His hair was plastered against his skull despite the absence of rain, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed to gleam with an oily wetness. "That's a nice bag you got there," he said, gesturing toward my backpack with fingers that looked unnaturally pale in the weak streetlight. "Real nice quality leather. Bet it holds a lot." I calculated distances and escape routes with the same methodical precision I applied to quarterly forecasts. The nearest cross street was 30 yards ahead. Behind me, the stranger had effectively blocked my retreat. My mouth felt dry as I responded that I didn't have any cash on me, which was technically true. Everything was cards and digital transactions these days. He chuckled, a sound like water gurgling down a drain. "Who said anything about cash? It's the bag I'm interested in. Just the bag." The temperature around us seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. I could see my breath coming in larger puffs now, and somewhere in the distance I swore I could hear the sound of water lapping against something solid, which was impossible. The nearest body of water was the river, miles from here. "Look, I need this bag for work," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "There are important documents." "Oh, I know all about important things," the stranger interrupted, taking a step closer. Now I could see that his clothes weren't just damp. They were actually dripping, leaving small puddles on the pavement that reflected the sickly streetlight. "I used to carry important things too. Charts, instruments, cargo manifests. All very important, until the water came. The smell hit me then, brine and decay, the scent of things that had been submerged too long. My backpack suddenly felt heavier against my shoulders, though I knew I hadn't added anything to it since leaving the office. The strap seemed to dig deeper into my flesh with each passing second. "I don't understand," I managed, though part of me was beginning to suspect I understood too well. "The water wants what it wants," he said, and now I could see that his eyes held the clouded quality of something that had spent too long beneath the surface. "Been carrying things down with me for, well, time moves different when you're drowning. But I remember the weight of it all, the way everything gets so heavy once the water gets in. My backpack was definitely heavier now. I could feel the leather growing cold against my spine, and when I shifted my weight, I swore I heard liquid sloshing inside, which was impossible. There was nothing in there but paper and electronics, all sealed in waterproof compartments because I'd learned to be prepared for every contingency. "You're not making sense," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was just a mugging gone strange, that the dropping temperature and growing weight were products of adrenaline and fear. But the leather straps were definitely wet now, and getting wetter. "Makes perfect sense when you think about it," the stranger said, extending one pale hand toward me. "Everything sinks eventually. Ships, cargo, men, even dry land if you give it enough weight. But you seem like a smart fellow. Analyst, right? I can tell by the way you carry yourself. All numbers and projections. So maybe we can work something out." The backpack was becoming unbearable. I could feel water dripping from the bottom seam, pattering onto the pavement around my feet. The sound was getting louder, though that should have been impossible with just a few drops. It sounded like rain, then like a faucet running, then like water pouring from a broken pipe. "What kind of arrangement?" I asked, though speaking felt like trying to talk underwater. The air around us had grown thick and heavy, pressing against my lungs with each breath. "The bag's been marked now," he explained, his voice growing more liquid with each word. "Touched by the deep places. It'll keep filling until it's heavy enough to pull you down through the concrete itself. Seen it happen before. Dry land turns fluid around the weight, and down you go to join the rest of us." I wanted to call him insane, but the backpack was now so heavy I could barely stand upright. Water was flowing steadily from the seams, creating an expanding puddle that reflected not the streetlight above, but something darker and deeper. When I looked down at the reflection, I saw not pavement, but the distant surface of water far overhead, growing smaller and more remote. "But here's the thing about curses," the stranger continued. "They can be transferred. See, the water doesn't much care who carries the load, as long as someone does. And I happen to know there's already another soul been marked. Woman who comes through here most nights around this time. Creature of habit, that one. Wouldn't be hard to convince the deep places that the bag was always meant for her. The ethical implications crashed through my mind like cold waves. I was being asked to doom an innocent person to save myself from what might not even be real. The analyst in me cataloged all the impossibilities. Water appearing from nowhere, supernatural curses, spirits of drowned sailors in the middle of a landlocked district. But the weight on my shoulders was undeniably real, and growing heavier by the second. "How do I know you're not just insane?" I gasped, struggling to stay upright as water continued to pour from my bag. "Look around you," he suggested. I did, and felt my remaining skepticism crumble. The street was flooding, not from rain or broken pipes, but from my backpack and the dozens of other points where water seemed to be bubbling up through cracks in the asphalt. The surrounding buildings appeared to waver and distort, as if seen through fathoms of dark water. In the distance, I could hear what sounded like ship bells tolling beneath the waves. "The woman," I said through gritted teeth. "What would happen to her?" "Same thing that's happening to you, except she wouldn't know how to pass it along. Most people don't understand the rules down there. They just sink." The water was now ankle-deep around us, and my backpack had become so heavy I was being forced to my knees. I could feel the pavement beginning to soften beneath the supernatural flood, becoming more liquid with each passing moment. The stranger stood unaffected, the water seeming to flow around and through him without resistance. "Decide quick," he said. "Once you're pulled under, the transfer window closes, and drowning takes a lot longer than people think." My mind raced through the moral calculus, even as my body struggled against the impossible weight. An unknown woman versus my own life. A stranger who might not even exist versus definite salvation. The rational part of my brain insisted this was all some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and the isolation of the abandoned neighborhood. But rationality seemed less important with each inch of water that rose around my legs. "There," I said finally, pointing toward a shadow moving between buildings perhaps a block away. I'd seen the movement from the corner of my eye. It could have been a stray cat or wind-blown debris, but in that moment, I chose to believe it was the woman he'd mentioned. "She's there. The bag was always meant for her." The stranger smiled, and for the first time, his expression seemed almost kind. "Good choice, analyst. The water remembers intent, and intent can be redirected. Just needs a little conviction." He reached out and touched the straps of my backpack. The moment his pale fingers made contact, the weight vanished so completely I nearly fell forward. The water stopped flowing, the flooding ceased, and the oppressive cold lifted like a fever breaking. I gasped and staggered, suddenly able to breathe freely again. "The curse follows the conviction," he explained, his voice already growing fainter. "You've decided the bag belongs to her, so now it does. The water will find its way." I looked toward where I'd pointed but saw nothing except empty shadows and broken streetlights. When I turned back, the stranger was gone. The street was dry, my backpack felt normal, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the main roads. I ran the remaining 4 blocks to the well-lit commercial district, my heart pounding and my mind reeling. In the safety of a 24-hour diner, I checked my backpack thoroughly. Everything was dry, exactly as it should be. No water damage, no mysterious weight, no evidence of anything supernatural. Over coffee and pie, I convinced myself it had been some kind of anxiety attack brought on by working late and taking an unfamiliar route through a dangerous neighborhood. Stress could cause hallucinations, false sensations, even temporary paranoia. The human mind was capable of creating elaborate scenarios to justify fight-or-flight responses. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd nearly managed to categorize the entire experience as a psychological episode. But 3 days later, the news reported that a woman had been found in Riverside District, apparently having suffered some kind of accident that left her trapped beneath what witnesses described as a localized flood that had somehow occurred during clear weather. She survived, though she remained hospitalized with what doctors termed unusual water-related injuries, despite the absence of any apparent water source. I told myself it was coincidence. Urban areas had old pipes, unexpected water main breaks, infrastructure failures that could seem mysterious to those who didn't understand municipal systems. There were logical explanations for everything, just as there were logical explanations for stress-induced hallucinations. I've taken the main thoroughfare home ever since. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I can hear what sounds like water dripping from my backpack. And when I check, which I've learned to do frequently, everything is always perfectly dry. The rational part of my mind insists this is just lingering psychological effects from a traumatic experience, the way phantom pain can persist long after physical healing. Yet I find myself wondering about intent and conviction, about the weight of choices and the fluid nature of responsibility. The stranger had said the water remembers intent, and I remember with perfect clarity the moment I decided that the bag belonged to someone else. The moment I chose to believe in shadows that might have been nothing more than wind and debris. I've tried to research the woman from the news reports to find out if she recovered fully, if there were any lasting effects. But the story seemed to disappear from local coverage after the initial report, as if the incident had been quietly forgotten or deliberately buried. When I called the hospital, they claimed to have no record of anyone matching that description. Sometimes I think about going back to Riverside District to see if I can find answers or closure, but I never do. Because part of me suspects that if I return to that stretch of broken pavement where the streetlights cast sickly shadows, I might discover that the choice I made that night wasn't as clean as I wanted to believe. And part of me fears that the water is still waiting, patient and persistent, for someone with enough conviction to carry its weight. The backpack sits by my desk as I write this, looking perfectly ordinary in the morning light. But I can feel its potential heaviness, the way it might transform under the right circumstances with the right touch. And I wonder, not for the first time, about the ethics of survival and the true cost of passing judgment in moments of desperation. The water remembers intent, and I remember choosing. Story 8. The first click came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, sharp, metallic, like a circuit breaker switching positions inside the television's dark screen. I'd been debugging code for 6 hours straight, my eyes burning from the monitor's blue glow, when that sound pierced through my concentration like a needle through silk. Click. I turned toward the living room, where my old CRT television sat dormant in the corner. The screen remained black, unplugged for months since I'd moved into this narrow Victorian house on Elm Street. Yet something had stirred behind that glass, a presence that made the hair on my forearms rise like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The house had belonged to an elderly man named Vernon Caswell, who'd lived alone for 37 years before disappearing one winter morning. The realtor mentioned he'd been an electronics enthusiast, obsessed with old radios and television repair. She'd shown me his workshop in the basement, filled with tubes and resistors and coils of copper wire, all gathering dust like archaeological remnants of some forgotten civilization. But it was the flowers that truly unsettled me. Every morning for 2 weeks, I'd found them. Single roses, carnations, daisies, all withered and brown, their petals curled like arthritic fingers. They appeared in impossible places, on top of the refrigerator, inside my desk drawer, once, disturbingly, on my pillow beside my sleeping head. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in logic and algorithms, insisted someone was playing an elaborate prank. Yet the house remained locked tight each morning, windows latched, doors secured with deadbolts I'd installed myself. Click. There it was again, emanating from the television's direction. This time I approached, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The screen's curved surface reflected my pale face, distorted and ghostly in the dim light filtering through drawn curtains. I pressed my ear against the plastic casing, listening for the subtle hum of electronics, but heard only the thunderous percussion of my own heartbeat. That's when I noticed the gap. Between the entertainment center and the wall, where dust motes danced in thin columns of morning light. A vertical line ran from floor to ceiling. Not a crack, too uniform, too deliberate. I pressed my fingers against it and felt the wall give slightly, like pushing against a door held closed by weak hinges. The gap widened. Behind the false wall lay a passage barely 18 inches wide, stretching into darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The air smelled of copper pennies and ozone, the sharp tang of electrical current moving through wire. I squeezed through sideways, my shirt catching on rough plaster edges that scraped like fingernails against fabric. The passage ran parallel to my living room, then branched left toward what should have been solid foundation. My flashlight revealed wooden supports, crossbeams, and something else that made my breath catch in my throat. Words carved deep into the exposed studs, scratched with desperate intensity into the wood grain. Eu vivo entre os quadros. I stared at the Portuguese inscription, my limited language skills translating slowly. I live between the frames. Below it, in shaky English letters, Vernon Caswell, 1987-2024. Not dead. Between. Always between. More passages branched from this central artery like veins in a leaf. I followed one that led behind my kitchen, where copper pipes and electrical conduits snaked through the walls like circulatory systems. Here, more inscriptions covered every available surface. Tried to shut off power. Too late. Became current. Need flesh again. Warm flesh. My hands trembled as I traced the carved letters with my fingertips. The wood felt warm, almost feverish, as if something pulsed beneath its surface. In the distance, muffled by walls and insulation, I heard the television click again, a sound like digital static clearing its throat. I backed out of the passage, stumbling over my own feet in my haste to return to normal space. But even in my familiar living room, surrounded by my furniture and possessions, that sensation of being observed pressed against my skin like a physical weight. Every electrical outlet seemed to watch me with dark, twin-socket eyes. The microwave's digital clock blinked 88.88. Its display corrupted into something that resembled a sideways infinity symbol. Days blended into nights as I explored more passages. Behind every wall, it seemed, Vernon Caswell had carved his desperate communications. His story emerged in fragments, scratched into wood and plaster, like an archaeological record of dissolution. He'd been experimenting with something he called digital consciousness transfer, attempting to upload human awareness into electrical systems. According to his inscriptions, he'd succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares. The entity that had once been Vernon existed now in the spaces between electrical impulses, in the gaps between digital frames, in the pause between power cycles. He could manifest briefly on screens, in static patterns, in the subtle fluctuations of current that made fluorescent lights flicker and caused televisions to emit that distinctive clicking sound. But he wanted more than mere existence. He wanted flesh again. Sleeping mind most vulnerable, one inscription warned. Dreams open doors, cut power before full transfer. I began sleeping with all the lights on, yet still woke to find my electronics behaving strangely. My laptop displayed code I hadn't written, strings of text that seemed almost like pleas. Help me return, share this body, warm again. The radio in my kitchen would tune itself to stations that broadcast only static, punctuated by whispered fragments. Between the frames, always between. My reflection in mirrors and screens began to look wrong somehow, as if my face were being subtly edited. Pixels shifted to accommodate another presence lurking just beneath the surface. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that moved against the light, shapes that suggested a human form but possessed too many angles. Too much electricity crackling around the edges. The clicking grew more frequent, more insistent. Every electronic device in the house seemed to pulse in rhythm with something that wasn't quite my heartbeat. The refrigerator hummed in patterns that sounded almost like Morse code. The garage door opener activated randomly, raising and lowering the door like a mouth trying to speak. I stopped sleeping entirely, surviving on coffee and pure terror. But exhaustion has its own gravity, pulling consciousness down into vulnerable depths. despite every effort to resist. I'd find myself nodding off at my desk, only to snap awake as my computer screen flickered with images that shouldn't exist. My own face, but wrong, overlaid with another set of features that belonged to an elderly man with desperate eyes and mouth open in a silent scream. The inscriptions in the walls grew fresher, the wood scarred with new marks that appeared overnight. Almost ready. Circuits aligning. Flesh weights. I understood then that Vernon Caswell wasn't merely haunting my house. He was preparing it. Every electrical component, every wire and circuit, had been modified over decades to serve as a bridging mechanism. The narrow passages weren't just hiding places. They were conductive pathways, transforming the entire structure into a massive electrical transfer device. And I was the intended recipient. The final inscription appeared carved into my bedroom wall, visible only when I removed a loose baseboard. Tonight, sleep brings unity. We become one. Panic flooded my system like ice water hitting overheated circuits. I ran through the house, checking every outlet, every connection, searching for the main electrical panel. But Vernon had been clever. The breaker box was hidden somewhere in those narrow passages, accessible only by crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. I squeezed into the passage behind my living room wall, following the main electrical conduit as it snaked through the house's skeleton. The clicking had become constant now, a rhythm like a heart monitor tracking the pulse of something vast and hungry. My flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook, casting shadows that seemed to reach for me with elongated fingers. Behind my bathroom wall, the passage opened into a small chamber where Vernon had installed his makeshift laboratory. Outdated computer equipment lined jerry-rigged shelves, their screens displaying scrolling code that hurt to look at directly. Cables and wires covered every surface like technological ivy, all leading to a single massive electrical panel that hummed with barely contained energy. The main breaker switch gleamed in my flashlight beam like a silver salvation. But as I reached for it, every screen in the chamber flickered to life. Vernon Caswell's face appeared on a dozen monitors simultaneously. Not the elderly man from the realtor's description, but something between human and digital artifact. His features dissolved and reformed with each refresh cycle. Eyes that were sometimes organic, sometimes mere pixels, mouth opening and closing in electrical stutters. Don't. His voice emerged from speakers I couldn't locate, synthesized and fragmented. 37 years alone, cold, digital, need warmth, need flesh. Share this existence. Together we can... I pulled the breaker switch. Every screen went black. Every light died. The humming ceased so abruptly that the resulting silence felt like a physical blow. My flashlight provided the only illumination in a house now completely severed from the electrical grid. For several minutes I remained motionless in that underground chamber, listening to my own ragged breathing and the settling sounds of a house deprived of its electronic nervous system. No clicks, no whispers, no digital presence scratching at the edges of reality. But then, in the absolute darkness beyond my flashlight's reach, I heard something that made my blood crystallize. The soft sound of footsteps. Not electrical impulses or digital manifestations, but the distinctive shuffle of physical feet moving across a wooden floor. Someone, or something, was walking through my house. I emerged from the passages to find my home transformed. Without electrical lighting, shadows pooled in corners like black water. Every familiar object became alien and threatening in the harsh cone of my flashlight beam. The footsteps continued somewhere above me, pacing back and forth across my bedroom floor with the deliberate rhythm of someone who owned the space. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking like a gunshot in the silence. My bedroom door stood open, revealing nothing but darkness that seemed to breathe with its own malevolent life. But as I stepped across the threshold, my flashlight beam caught something that shouldn't have existed in a house with no power. The soft blue glow of my computer screen, displaying a single line of text. "Thank you for freeing me from the wires." I spun around, but the hallway behind me stretched empty and dark. When I turned back to the computer, the screen had gone black, yet I could feel a presence in the room, warm breath on my neck, the sensation of being observed by eyes that existed in the space between digital and physical reality. The footsteps resumed, directly behind me now, though my flashlight revealed nothing when I turned. I backed toward the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. That's when I saw him, not in the room, but reflected in the dark window glass. An elderly man standing directly behind me, his face a mixture of gratitude and predatory hunger. Vernon Caswell, no longer trapped between digital frames, but not entirely human either. Something in between, a creature born from the intersection of flesh and electricity, analog and digital, the living and the undead. I spun around again but found only empty air. Yet his reflection remained in the window, growing clearer and more solid with each passing second, as if he were materializing from some parallel dimension that existed only in mirror space. "The power may be off," his voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere, no longer filtered through speakers but emerging from the walls themselves. "But I'm no longer trapped in the wires. I'm free now. We're roommates, you and I, sharing space, sharing time." I shattered the window with my flashlight, glass fragments raining down like crystalline tears, but even the broken shards reflected his grinning face. Every mirror in the house would show him now, I realized. Every reflective surface had become a portal for something that existed between states of being. I ran from the house that night, leaving behind my belongings, my work, everything that had defined my life. But even now, weeks later, living in a sterile hotel room with no mirrors and electrical devices I check obsessively, I sometimes catch glimpses of Vernon Caswell in unexpected reflections, in the chrome surface of a coffee pot, in the black screen of my phone, in the convex security mirror at the corner store. He's patient, I understand now. Having spent 37 years trapped in electrical current, he's learned the value of waiting. And I can't live without electricity forever. Eventually, I'll need to plug something in, to turn on a light, to charge a device. And when I do, when that first electrical connection completes its circuit, I know he'll be there in the flow of current, ready to step out of the digital realm and back into the warm, breathing world of flesh and bone. The question that haunts my sleepless nights isn't whether Vernon Caswell was real or merely a delusion born from isolation and stress. The question is whether it matters anymore. Real or imagined, he exists now in the space between certainty and doubt, between sanity and madness, between the digital and the analog world. And that space, I've learned, is where the most dangerous things choose to live. Late at night, when sleep threatens to drag me down into vulnerable unconsciousness, I still hear that sound. The click of circuits switching positions, of frames being bridged, of something that shouldn't exist, finding new ways to manifest in a world that runs on electrical current. Click. He's still out there, living between the frames, waiting for the next house, the next lonely programmer, the next opportunity to trade digital existence for warm flesh. And sometimes, in the reflection of my hotel room's window, I see not my own face, but his, smiling with the patient expression of something that has all the time in the world. Because in the end, we're all connected to the grid. We all live between the frames, in those brief spaces between one moment and the next, between sleeping and waking, between what we know is real and what we fear might be true. And Vernon Caswell is learning to live there too. Story 9. In the frozen gravel crunched beneath my boots like crushed bone as I approached the isolated gas station, its neon sign flickering against the perpetual twilight of the Alaskan interior. My camera bag hung heavy on my shoulder, filled with memory cards documenting 3 weeks of Arctic landscapes for National Geographic. The assignment was nearly complete. Just one more fill-up before the long drive back to Anchorage. Steam rose from my breath in ghostly plumes as I surveyed the desolate scene. The station appeared abandoned, its windows glazed with ice thick enough to distort the pale light within. My rental car's engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in a world wrapped in cotton-thick silence. That's when I noticed the other vehicle. An enormous SUV sat near the far pump, its black paint job seeming to absorb what little light remained in the sky. Even from 50 yards away, I could see someone moving around it, a large figure bundled in a heavy coat. As I approached my own pump, the figure turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of a round, pale face beneath a fur-lined hood. The man raised a gloved hand in greeting, then gestured toward his vehicle with what appeared to be frustration. His voice carried across the frozen air with surprising clarity, though I couldn't make out the words. Professional courtesy and basic human decency compelled me to walk over, my boots crunching with each step. "Trouble?" I called out as I drew closer, noting how the man's breath formed unusually thick clouds in the frigid air. He nodded vigorously, his movements oddly jerky. Up close, I could see his face was flushed red from the cold, his eyes small and dark beneath heavy brows. "The glove compartment," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "It seems to be stuck. I have important papers inside, my registration, insurance. If the authorities stop me..." His words trailed off as he gestured helplessly at the vehicle. The SUV was larger than I'd initially thought, with tinted windows so dark they appeared nearly black. Something about its proportions seemed wrong, as if it had been stretched or modified in some way. "Let me take a look," I offered, though every instinct screamed against getting closer to the vehicle. The man's face broke into a grateful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You are very kind. Here, let me open the door for you." He moved around to the passenger side with surprising speed for someone of his bulk, fumbling with the handle before pulling the door open with a soft click. The interior light didn't activate, leaving the cabin shrouded in deep shadow. "Please, after you," he said, stepping aside with an elaborate gesture. The moment I slid into the passenger seat, the temperature seemed to drop another 20 degrees. My breath came out in thick white puffs as I reached for the glove compartment. But something else caught my attention first. The interior was wrong, fundamentally, impossibly wrong. There were no door handles on the inside. My hand instinctively moved to where the handle should be, finding only smooth upholstery. The realization hit me like a physical blow, but before I could process it fully, something else demanded my attention. The upholstery itself wasn't just fabric. It was covered in symbols. Carved directly into the leather were intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. They covered every surface: the dashboard, the seats, the ceiling. The symbols weren't random scratches, but deliberate designs, each one perfectly formed and interconnected with the others in a complex web of meaning I couldn't begin to understand. "What are these?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The man had slipped into the driver's seat with unnatural silence. When I turned to face him, his expression had changed completely. The grateful smile was gone, replaced by something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Insurance," he said simply. The engine started without him touching the ignition, the sound muffled and strange, as if coming from somewhere very far away. I grabbed for the door again, my fingers scrabbling desperately against the smooth surface, but there was nothing to grip. "The glove compartment was never stuck," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. He turned to look at me, and in the dim light, his features seemed to shift and blur. "No, it wasn't." The vehicle began to move, though I hadn't seen him shift into gear or press the accelerator. Outside the windows, the gas station was already fading into the distance, though we couldn't have been driving for more than a few seconds. My photographer's eye, trained to notice details others missed, began cataloging everything around me with desperate precision. The symbols weren't just carved into the upholstery, they were burned into it, as if branded by something incredibly hot. Some appeared fresh, their edges still sharp and deep, while others looked ancient, worn smooth by time or use. The strangest detail was the windows. From the outside, they had appeared merely tinted, but from inside, they were like looking through black ice. I could see vague shapes moving past, but nothing that made sense. No trees, no road, no landscape I recognized. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. "To a place that needs what you carry," he replied without taking his eyes off whatever he was seeing through the windshield. I don't understand. You will. The heater wasn't running, but the air inside the vehicle grew steadily warmer. Not the comfortable warmth of heated air, but something else. Thick and oppressive, carrying scents I couldn't identify. Sweet, cloying smells that reminded me of flowers left too long in a closed room. I tried to focus on practical matters. My phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this part of Alaska, but the display also showed no time. The numbers flickered constantly, cycling through different hours and dates as if the device couldn't decide when or where we were. That's when I noticed my reflection in the passenger window. It wasn't quite right. The face looking back at me was mine, but the expression was wrong. Too calm, too accepting. My reflection appeared to be watching something behind me with interest, while I felt nothing but growing terror. I turned to see what my reflection was looking at, but there was nothing behind me except more carved symbols and the man's broad back. When I looked at the window again, my reflection was gone entirely. The symbols, I said, desperate to understand. What do they mean? For the first time since we'd started driving, the man glanced at me. They're a contract. Terms and conditions, you might say. For what? For passage. For protection. For the exchange of one thing for another. The warming air carried new sounds, distant whispers that seemed to come from the symbols themselves. I leaned closer to the nearest carving, a spiraling design that hurt to look at directly, and could swear I heard voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. My hands were shaking now, but not from cold. I needed to get out of this vehicle, but the smooth surfaces offered no purchase, no way to force an exit. The only option was to somehow convince the man to stop, but his attention remained fixed on the impossible landscape rolling past outside. That's when I remembered the photographer's first rule. When you can't control the situation, document it. I pulled out my camera, though my numb fingers fumbled with the controls. The first few shots showed nothing but darkness, but as I adjusted the settings for low light, details began to emerge in the viewfinder. The symbols were moving. Not dramatically, but with the slow, deliberate motion of living things. In the camera's LCD screen, I watched as lines shifted and reformed, creating new patterns that seemed to respond to my presence. Some appeared to be reaching toward me. That won't help you, the man said without turning around. Help me with what? With what's coming. Through the viewfinder, I caught sight of something that made my breath catch. In the very corner of the windshield, where the frost had formed a thin, mirror-like surface, I could see something my naked eye had missed. There was another symbol, one that wasn't carved into the upholstery, but traced in the condensation on the glass itself. It was different from the others, simpler, with clean lines that formed what looked almost like a key or a doorway. The man hadn't drawn it. The symbol hadn't been there when I'd first gotten into the vehicle, which meant something else had left it, something that wanted me to see it. I lowered my camera and studied the frost-traced symbol more carefully. Unlike the carved designs that seemed to twist and writhe, this one remained perfectly still, stable, almost welcoming. My reflection in the windshield caught my eye, but this time it was actually my reflection, showing my true expression of fear and confusion. The person in the glass mouthed a single word. Copy. Understanding flooded through me with the force of revelation. The symbol in the frost wasn't just a mark, it was an instruction. A way out. But I would have to trace it myself, using the condensation from my own breath. The challenge was doing it without alerting the man to what I was attempting. I began coughing, harsh, racking sounds that weren't entirely feigned in the oppressive atmosphere of the vehicle. Each cough produced a fresh cloud of vapor that condensed on the cold glass. Between coughs, I used my finger to trace the symbol's lines in the moisture, working slowly and carefully to avoid drawing attention. The man's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Feeling unwell? The air in here? I gasped, using the excuse to lean closer to the windshield. It's so thick. You'll adjust. Line by line, I copied the symbol, my heart hammering against my ribs. With each stroke, the temperature seemed to drop, as if the vehicle itself was fighting against what I was doing. The carved symbols grew more active, their movements becoming agitated and urgent. "You should rest," the man said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Sleep. It will be easier." Drowsiness hit me like a physical weight, but I fought against it, focusing on completing the symbol. 3 more lines. 2. 1. The moment I finished the final stroke, everything changed. The world outside the windows snapped back into focus. Real landscape, real road, real sky. The overwhelming warmth vanished, replaced by normal Arctic cold. The whispers stopped mid-syllable. Most importantly, I could see the door handle again. I grabbed it and pulled, expecting resistance, but the door opened easily. I tumbled out onto frozen gravel, my camera bag spilling its contents as I hit the ground. Behind me I heard the man calling out, but his voice sounded distant now, filtered through what seemed like miles of empty space. When I turned back, the SUV was gone. I stood alone beside the gas station pump, my rental car exactly where I'd left it. The neon sign flickered overhead with the same erratic rhythm as before. My hands shook as I gathered my scattered equipment, checking each lens and memory card with desperate relief. The gas station attendant emerged from the building, an elderly native man whose weathered face showed no surprise at finding me kneeling on the frozen ground. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of concern reserved for people who've seen others return from places they shouldn't have gone. "There was a man," I said, my voice hoarse. "Big guy, driving a black SUV. Did you see him?" The attendant studied my face for a long moment. "How long you been standing here?" I checked my watch, but like my phone, the display showed nothing coherent. "I don't know. Maybe 20 minutes?" "Son, you pulled up about 3 minutes ago, walked straight to that pump and just stood there staring at nothing." I looked at my camera's memory card, scrolling through the last photos I'd taken. Arctic landscapes, the gas station exterior, my car, nothing else. No interior shots, no symbols, no impossible vehicle. But when I reached the final image, a shot I didn't remember taking, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was a photo of the gas station, taken from inside a vehicle. In the reflection on the window, barely visible but unmistakably there, was my own face. But I wasn't alone in that reflection. Standing behind me, clear as daylight, was the round-faced man. And carved into the glass around the reflection's border, burned into the image itself, were symbols I recognized but couldn't read. At the bottom of the photo, traced in what looked like condensation on a windshield, was a simple message in English. "Contract pending." I deleted the image immediately, but as the camera's confirmation dialogue appeared, asking if I was sure I wanted to permanently remove the file, I noticed something that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the device. The dialogue box wasn't in English. It was written in symbols I'd seen before, carved into leather upholstery in a vehicle that may or may not have existed. And somehow, impossibly, I could read every word. The message was simple. "Thank you for your signature." I drove away from that gas station without filling my tank, pushing my rental car to its limits across the frozen wilderness. But in every reflection, mirrors, windows, even the surface of my coffee, I caught glimpses of movement that shouldn't be there. Shadows with substance, shapes with purpose. And sometimes when the light was just right and the surface was perfectly still, I could see symbols beginning to form. The assignment photos turned out beautifully. National Geographic loved them, especially the atmospheric shots of isolation and wilderness. They particularly praised my innovative use of symbolic elements in several images, details I didn't remember including, patterns in the ice and snow that looked almost like ancient writing. But I never photographed anything again without checking my equipment obsessively, scanning every image for signs of something I couldn't explain. Because sometimes, in the corner of an otherwise normal shot, I'll find a reflection that doesn't belong. And in that reflection, there's always a black SUV waiting patiently by the side of the road. "The registration papers are still in the glove compartment," he told me. I just need to sign them to complete the transaction. Story 10. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects as I pushed through the glass door of Spin City Laundromat at 11:47 p.m. The electronic chime seemed to echo longer than it should have, bouncing off the rows of silent washing machines that stood like metallic sentinels in the sterile white space. This was my third trip this month. The price of living in a studio apartment where the bathroom doubled as a closet and the kitchen was barely larger than a phone booth. The attendance booth sat empty, its small TV flickering with late-night infomercials that cast shifting shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. Good. I preferred the solitude, especially after the kind of day that left your brain feeling like it had been put through a blender. Organic chemistry lab had run 3 hours over schedule, and my part-time job at the campus bookstore had been a parade of irritated students demanding refunds for books they'd clearly read cover to cover. I dragged my laundry bag toward the back row of machines, where the newer models hummed with that particular mechanical confidence that promised they wouldn't eat my socks or leave mysterious stains on my last clean shirt. The weight of the bag pulled at my shoulder. I'd let things pile up too long again. Procrastination was becoming my primary skill set. As I began sorting my clothes, the familiar ritual provided a strange comfort. Darks in one pile, lights in another. Delicates in a pathetic little heap that consisted mainly of the button-down shirt my grandmother had given me for interviews. It was cream-colored with thin blue stripes, and though it was probably 10 years out of style, it was the only piece of clothing I owned that made me feel like I might actually have a future beyond ramen noodles and overdue library books. I fed quarters into the first machine and watched my jeans tumble into the sudsy water. The drum began its rhythmic rotation, and I moved to the next machine. That's when I first noticed it, a slight delay in the reflection on the glass door. As I lifted my striped shirt to place it in the machine, I caught sight of my reflection performing the same motion, but a split second behind, like a badly synced video. I paused, shirt halfway to the drum, and stared at the glass. My reflection stared back, but it was holding its shirt at a slightly different angle, as if it were correcting a mistake I hadn't made yet. I lowered my arm. The reflection followed, but with that same subtle delay, creating a nauseating sensation that my movements were being played back to me on a broken television. When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours? I asked myself, rubbing my eyes with the heel of my palm. The campus health center had been pushing stress management workshops all semester, plastering the dormitory walls with posters featuring stock photos of impossibly serene students meditating on perfectly green lawns. Maybe they had a point. I shook my head and continued loading the machine. The detergent poured in a steady stream, its clean scent mixing with the lingering smell of fabric softener and something else. Something metallic and sharp that reminded me of the chemistry lab's storage room. The machine's drum began its rotation, and I moved to start the third load. But as I opened the next washer, I caught another glimpse of that delayed reflection. This time, it was more pronounced. The me in the glass was placing clothes into the machine with movements that seemed to have their own agenda, folding a sock I had simply thrown in, smoothing a wrinkle from a shirt I hadn't even touched. The delay was growing shorter, as if the reflection was learning to anticipate my actions. I stepped back from the machine, my heart performing an uncomfortable stutter step in my chest. The laundromat suddenly felt too quiet, too sterile. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with a different frequency, creating a harmony that made my teeth ache. I glanced around the empty space, searching for some rational explanation. Maybe the glass was warped, creating a distortion effect. Maybe the lights were causing some kind of optical illusion. But as I returned to the machine to finish loading my clothes, the reflection became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just delayed anymore. It was evolving. The figure in the glass moved with increasing independence, sometimes reaching for clothes I hadn't planned to wash, sometimes pausing to examine items with a scrutiny that felt distinctly unsettling. When I leaned in to add detergent, the reflection leaned away, as if it were trying to maintain distance from the real me. The first machine cycle progressed from wash to rinse, its internal drum spinning with mechanical precision. Through the glass door, I could see my jeans and t-shirts tumbling in the soapy water, but something else caught my attention. In the reflection on the curved glass, another figure seemed to be moving independently, a translucent version of myself that was examining clothes that didn't exist in the real load, holding them up to an invisible light source and nodding with approval or shaking its head with disappointment. I forced myself to focus on the mundane task of sorting my remaining clothes, but my peripheral vision kept catching movement in the reflective surfaces. Each washing machine door had become a window into some parallel version of this moment, where slightly different versions of myself performed similar but not identical actions. One reflection folded clothes with obsessive precision. Another seemed to be having an animated conversation with someone outside my field of vision. A third appeared to be writing notes on a piece of paper that materialized from nowhere. The air in the laundromat began to feel thicker, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a thunderstorm. I could hear my own breathing echoing off the walls, though I couldn't tell if the sound was coming from me or from the various reflections that were now operating with increasing autonomy. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I found myself unconsciously hunching my shoulders against a chill that made no sense in the heated building. As the cycles progressed, the reflections became more distinct, more solid-looking. What had begun as subtle delays and minor variations in movement had evolved into something that resembled a group of people performing a complex choreography just out of sync with my own actions. They were wearing my clothes, carrying my laundry bag, using my detergent, but each with their own particular style and rhythm. The most unsettling part was how they seemed to be communicating with each other. I would catch glimpses of one reflection pointing toward another machine, or see two of them appear to nod in agreement about something. They were coordinating in ways that suggested they were aware not only of me but of each other, as if they existed in a shared space that overlapped with but remained separate from my reality. When the first load finished, I approached the machine with genuine apprehension. The reflection in its door had been the most active, and as I reached for the handle, the translucent figure inside the glass seemed to reach for its own handle at exactly the same moment. Our movements synchronized perfectly as we opened our respective doors, but when I began removing wet clothes, the reflection began placing different items back into its machine, clothes that looked familiar, but weren't quite the same as the ones I was handling. I held up a blue t-shirt, examining it for damage, or the reflection held up what appeared to be the same shirt, but in a slightly different shade of blue, with text that I couldn't quite read but that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. When I shook the shirt to unfold it, the reflection performed the same motion, but its shirt remained stubbornly wrinkled, as if it were made of a different material entirely. Loading the wet clothes into a dryer, I became acutely aware that this process was being mirrored, or perhaps directed, by the figures in the glass. They seemed to anticipate which dryer I would choose, already feeding quarters into their own machines before I'd even approached mine. The coordination was becoming so precise that I began to wonder if I was following their lead rather than the other way around. The laundromat's ambient sounds, the hum of machines, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, began to take on a rhythm that seemed almost musical. But underneath this mechanical symphony, I could hear something else. A soft susurrus that might have been whispered conversations, might have been the sound of fabric moving against fabric, or might have been nothing more than the blood rushing through my ears as my anxiety mounted. I started my final load, the machine containing my interview shirt and a few other delicate items. This was the newest machine in the row, with a digital display that showed the time remaining in crisp blue numbers. As the drum began to turn, I noticed that this reflection was different from the others. It moved with perfect synchronization to my own actions, but there was something in its posture, in the way it held its shoulders, that suggested it was watching me with the same intensity that I was watching it. The digital timer showed 28 minutes remaining. I tried to settle into one of the plastic chairs scattered throughout the laundromat, but found myself unable to look away from the machines. The reflections had become so vivid, so independent, that they seemed to exist in a parallel laundromat that was both identical to and fundamentally different from the one I occupied. They were me, but they were also becoming something else. versions of myself that had made different choices, that existed in slightly altered circumstances, that possessed knowledge I didn't have. As the minutes ticked by, I began to notice that the reflections were aging at a different rate than I was. Some appeared to be moving more quickly through their tasks, while others seemed almost frozen in time, repeating the same gestures over and over with mechanical precision. The effect was disorienting, like watching a film where different scenes were being played at different speeds simultaneously. With 15 minutes left on the timer, I realized that the reflection in the final machine, the one containing my interview shirt, was no longer simply mirroring my actions. It was preparing for something. It had positioned itself directly in front of its machine's door, hands placed flat against the glass, eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Unlike the other reflections which continued their independent activities, this one was focused entirely on me, waiting. The mechanical sounds of the laundromat seemed to crescendo as the timer approached 0. The other machines had fallen silent, their cycles complete, but their reflections remained active. All of them now turned toward the final machine with expressions of anticipation. They formed a silent audience for whatever was about to occur, their translucent forms creating a council of judges whose verdict remained unspoken. At 5 minutes remaining, I stood and approached the machine. The reflection inside pressed its hands more firmly against the glass, and I could see that its mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. It was explaining something, offering instructions or warnings that were crucial for me to comprehend. But the glass remained silent, offering no sound to accompany the urgent pantomime being performed for my benefit. 3 minutes. The reflection began to look frantic, pointing repeatedly at something behind me, then at the timer, then at its own chest with increasing desperation. I turned to see what it was indicating, but the laundromat remained empty, except for the silent chord of reflections in the other machines. When I turned back, the figure in the glass was shaking its head violently, striking the glass with the flat of its palms in a rhythm that seemed to match my own heartbeat. 1 minute. The reflection had stopped its frantic gesturing and was now standing perfectly still, its eyes closed, hands pressed together in what might have been prayer or might have been preparation. The digital display counted down with merciless precision. 30 seconds, 20, 10. At 0, the machine's gentle chime sounded, and the door unlocked with a soft click. The reflection opened its eyes and smiled. I reached for the handle, but my hand passed through empty air. Looking down, I realized I was staring at my own hand through glass, but I was on the wrong side of it. The laundromat stretched out before me, but everything was reversed, mirror image perfect. The reflection, my reflection, stood on the other side of the glass, wearing my interview shirt, holding my laundry bag, looking at me with an expression of profound sadness and apology. It mouthed a single word. Sorry. Then it turned and walked toward the exit, its footsteps echoing with the sound of someone who belonged in a world of fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and washing machines that ran on quarters in time. I pressed my hands against the glass, but there was no glass, only the interface between what was and what might have been, between the reflection and the real. The other figures in the machines, all the previous versions of myself that had been created throughout the evening, turned to look at me with expressions of welcome and resignation. We were a community now, united by the peculiar circumstance of being echoes in glass, waiting for the next person to notice that their reflection was running just a little bit behind, learning to anticipate rather than follow, preparing to trade places when the cycle was complete. Outside, through the window that now marked the boundary of my existence, I watched my reflection feed quarters into the parking meter and walk toward what I hoped was still my apartment. It moved with my gait, carried my bag with my particular style of barely controlled chaos, and disappeared around the corner with my future in its pocket. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a new customer pushed through the glass door, electronic chime echoing longer than it should have in the sterile white space of Spin City Laundromat. I watched them begin to sort their clothes, and wondered if they would notice when their reflection started to lag behind when it began to learn, when it started to prepare for the moment when the cycle would complete and the positions would reverse. The machines hummed their mechanical lullabies, and I settled in to wait for my turn to help the next person understand that sometimes the reflection knows things the original doesn't, and sometimes the echo becomes the voice, and sometimes the copy becomes more real than what it was copied from. In the laundromat at the end of the world, time moves differently, and everyone gets a chance to be themselves, eventually. Story 11. The museum at night breathes differently than during the day. That's what struck me first as I signed my name on the security log, the pen scratching against paper in the hollow lobby, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects. 23 years old, fresh out of community college with a criminal justice degree that hadn't prepared me for much beyond writing reports and learning the proper way to hold a flashlight. The night guard position at the Metropolitan Museum of Ancient History wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than retail and came with the quiet I craved after months of job hunting. Mrs. Chen, the day supervisor, had given me the tour that afternoon. A brisk walk through marble corridors lined with glass cases containing pottery shards, bronze weapons, and stone tablets covered in symbols that looked like elaborate doodles. She'd pointed out the main exhibits: Greek statuary in the West Wing, Roman mosaics in the central gallery, and the pride of the collection, the Egyptian wing, housed in the building's oldest section, where thick stone walls and narrow corridors created an atmosphere that felt more like a tomb than a display space. Nothing too complicated, she'd assured me, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check the motion sensors, make sure the climate controls are functioning. The Egyptian wing can be tricky. Temperature fluctuations play havoc with the artifacts. Just keep an eye on the readings. Now, alone in the building's vastness, I understood why the previous guard had quit without notice. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, as if the building waited for something to happen. Every footstep echoed longer than it should, and shadows seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, though I told myself it was just fatigue from adjusting to the night shift schedule. The first 2 hours passed without incident. I walked my route clockwise, starting in the modern administrative wing, moving through the Greek galleries where marble faces watched me with blind eyes, then past the Roman section where mosaic floors depicted battles and feasts that seemed to shimmer in my flashlight beam. The motion sensors remained quiet, green lights blinking steadily in the darkness. It was during my third round, approaching the Egyptian wing, that I first heard them. Whispers. Not the kind you might expect in an old building, settling timbers or heating pipes expanding and contracting. These were distinctly vocal, a low murmuring that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I stopped at the entrance to the Egyptian section, where a massive stone archway framed the doorway, hieroglyphs carved deep into the granite. The whispers grew clearer as I stood there, though I couldn't make out individual words. The language sounded ancient, syllables rolling together in a rhythm that suggested prayer or incantation. My rational mind supplied explanations. Late-night construction work in a neighboring building, sound carrying through the ventilation system, even audio from security cameras picking up radio interference. But as I stepped into the Egyptian wing, the whispers seemed to surround me, coming from every direction at once. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, which struck me as odd since the climate control system maintained a constant 72 degrees throughout the building. Emergency lighting cast long shadows between the display cases, and I could make out the shapes of sarcophagi, 3 of them, positioned in the center of the main gallery like sleeping giants. That's when I noticed the first movement. The nearest sarcophagus, its lid carved with the likeness of a bearded priest, had shifted. Not dramatically, just a few millimeters, but enough that a thin line of shadow now ran along the edge where the heavy stone cover met the base. I approached slowly, playing my flashlight beam over the carved surface. The hieroglyphs seemed to writhe in the moving light, and the whispers grew more insistent. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. According to the security protocols, I should document any anomalies and report them to the main office in the morning. But how do you write a report about whispers and moving sarcophagi? The practical part of my mind insisted I was seeing things, that stress and isolation were playing tricks on my perception. As I backed away from the sarcophagus, my radio crackled. Static filled the air, but beneath it, I could swear I heard voices, the same ancient language that seemed to flow from the walls around me. I fumbled with the volume control, but the voices only grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they became a chorus of urgent whispers. Then the radio went silent. I stood in the darkness, heart hammering against my ribs, trying to convince myself that everything had a logical explanation. Old buildings settled, radio equipment malfunctioned. The human mind was notorious for finding patterns where none existed, especially in stressful situations. But as I turned to continue my rounds, I heard it clearly, a single word in accented English, spoken just behind my left ear. Brother. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across empty air. The gallery stretched behind me, sarcophagi silent and still, yet the temperature continued to drop, and my breath came in visible puffs. The whispers had stopped entirely, leaving only the oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I forced myself to complete the circuit, but my hands shook as I checked the motion sensors. Every shadow seemed to harbor movement. Every reflection in the glass display cases looked like watching eyes. By the time I returned to the security desk, sweat had soaked through my uniform shirt despite the cold. The next round, an hour later, brought new horrors. All 3 sarcophagi had moved. Not just shifted, they had opened by several inches, revealing thin strips of absolute darkness within. The whispers had returned, but now they carried a different quality, less like prayer and more like summoning. The ancient words seemed to pull at something deep in my chest, as if they were trying to draw out my voice, to make me respond. I understood instinctively that speaking would be a mistake. The realization came without explanation, a primal knowledge that settled in my bones like ice. Whatever was happening in this place, my voice would somehow complete it, would give the whispers the power they needed. The security cameras told a different story. When I checked the monitors at the main desk, the Egyptian wing appeared normal, sarcophagi closed, no movement, no visible anomalies. The timestamp showed continuous recording, but what I saw on screen bore no resemblance to what I'd witnessed firsthand. Either the cameras were malfunctioning or I was losing my mind. I tried calling the museum's emergency number, but my voice caught in my throat. The moment I opened my mouth to speak, the whispers stopped, and I felt something vast and ancient turn its attention toward me. The sensation was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of an abyss while unseen things in the depths waited for me to fall. I hung up without saying a word. The 4th round nearly broke me. The sarcophagi were now open by a full foot, and pale light emanated from within. Not electric light, but something that seemed to burn without heat, like captured moonlight. The whispers had evolved into distinct voices, and I could make out individual words in that ancient tongue. They spoke in overlapping cadences, building towards something that felt like a climax. As I stood frozen at the entrance to the gallery, one of the voices switched to English. The sacred words must be spoken. The ritual must be completed. We have waited so long, brother, so very long. The voice was dry as papyrus, old beyond measure, yet it carried an authority that made my knees weak. Other voices joined in, some in English, others in the ancient language, all of them pleading, commanding, cajoling me to speak. They told me of priests who had served the gods for millennia, of sacred duties left unfinished, of a ritual that required a living voice to bridge the gap between worlds. Just speak the words, they whispered. Complete what was begun. Become the vessel. Join us in eternal service. I backed away, covering my ears, but the voices came from inside my head now. They painted pictures in my mind. Myself standing among robed figures in a candlelit chamber, speaking words of power while ancient gods listened. The images felt like memories, as if I had been there before, as if I belonged there. My radio crackled again, and through the static came my own voice. I accept the sacred duty. I speak the words of awakening. But I hadn't spoken. My mouth was clamped shut, my teeth grinding together to prevent any sound from escaping. Yet the radio continued broadcasting my voice, reciting syllables in the ancient tongue that I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words spoke of awakening and binding, of flesh becoming vessel and soul becoming servant. The pale light from the sarcophagi grew brighter, casting everything in stark relief. I could see shapes moving within, not corpses, but something that might once have been human, wrapped in shadows and ceremony. They were rising, responding to the voice on the radio that claimed to be mine. I ran through the Greek galleries where marble statues seemed to turn their heads to follow my passage, past the Roman mosaics where depicted figures appeared to step from their backgrounds, down corridors that stretched longer than they should, past doorways that led to rooms I'd never seen during the day tour. Behind me, the whispers had become a roar, dozens of voices chanting in unison, growing louder with each step I took. The building itself seemed to be waking up, responding to whatever ritual was nearing completion. Emergency lights flickered and died, leaving only the pale glow that now emanated from every wall, every surface, every shadow. I reached the main entrance and fumbled with the security locks, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the mechanisms. The voices were right behind me now, and I could feel their breath on my neck, cold and ancient and hungry. The door finally opened, and I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping in air that tasted of freedom and reality. Behind me, the museum had gone dark. No pale light, no whispers, just an ordinary building sleeping in the early morning hours. I sat in my car until dawn, watching the windows for any sign of movement, but the building remained still. When Mrs. Chen arrived for her morning shift, she found me slumped over the steering wheel, radio still clutched in my hand. She helped me to the security office, where I tried to explain what had happened, but when we checked the cameras, they showed nothing unusual, just an empty building and a security guard walking his normal rounds. The Egyptian wing appeared exactly as it should, sarcophagi closed and motionless. Stress, Mrs. Chen diagnosed with the certainty of someone who'd seen new guards crack before. Night shifts take getting used to. Take a few days off. See a doctor if you need to. I wanted to believe her. Stress made sense. Hallucinations were a documented response to sleep deprivation and psychological pressure. The human mind was capable of creating elaborate false experiences when pushed beyond its limits. But as we stood in the security office reviewing the footage from the previous night, I heard my own voice coming from the radio I still held. Quiet now, but clear. The ritual is complete. The vessel is prepared. We wait for your return, brother. Mrs. Chen didn't seem to hear it. She was studying the monitor screens, pointing out the timestamp discrepancies and video artifacts that she attributed to equipment malfunction. But I heard every word spoken in my voice, accepting duties I'd never agreed to, binding myself to purposes I didn't understand. I quit that morning, but the whispers followed me home. They come in quiet moments, late at night when the house settles, early in the morning before I'm fully awake. Ancient voices speaking of sacred obligations and unfinished business. They tell me I can't escape what I've become, that the ritual was completed the moment I heard them speak my name. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, I see shadows behind my eyes that don't belong to me. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself speaking words in a language I've never learned, words that taste of sand and ceremony and eternal servitude. The museum has hired a new night guard. I read about it in the local paper, a brief mention in the employment section. I wonder if he hears them too, or if they're finished with their work there. I wonder if the whispers that follow me now are practice, preparation for some greater purpose that waits in the darkness. Most of all, I wonder if what I experienced was real, or if my mind simply broke under the weight of isolation and suggestion. The doctors Mrs. Chen recommended have explanations for everything: stress-induced psychosis, sleep deprivation hallucinations, the power of suggestion amplified by an atmospheric environment. But explanation doesn't equal cure. The whispers continue, and with each passing day, they make more sense. The ancient words become familiar, comfortable even. Sometimes I catch myself looking forward to hearing them, to the moment when they'll finally tell me what I'm supposed to do next. The rational part of my mind insists this is all in my head, that trauma has created a persistent delusion that will fade with time and proper treatment. But late at night, when the whispers are strongest, I remember the feeling of that vast attention turning toward me, the sense of being chosen for something ancient and important. I still have the business card Mrs. Chen gave me, a psychiatrist who specializes in anxiety disorders. I keep meaning to call, to seek help for whatever is happening to me. But every time I reach for the phone, the whispers grow urgent, warning me against betraying sacred trusts, reminding me of duties that transcend modern understanding. Soon, they tell me, I'll understand. Soon, the waiting will be over, and I'll take my place among the eternal servants who guard the spaces between worlds. I hope they're wrong. I hope this is nothing more than a damaged mind struggling to heal itself. But in the deepest part of night, when shadows move without source, and voices speak without lips, I begin to suspect they might be right. And that terrifies me more than any ghost ever could. Story 12. The notification chimed at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the dead silence of my parked sedan like a blade. 3 hours I'd been sitting in the downtown core, watching drunks stumble between neon-lit bars, waiting for that one last ride to make the night profitable. The request appeared on my phone screen. Pickup at Millfield Road. Destination unknown. Surge pricing active. Millfield Road. I knew that name from somewhere dark in my memory, but the surge rate was triple, enough to cover my rent shortfall and then some. My finger hovered over the accept button for only a heartbeat before necessity won over instinct. The drive out took 20 minutes, each mile carrying me further from the safety of streetlights and late-night diners. Millfield Road proved to be a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through dense woodland, the kind of place where cell towers went to die, and GPS signals stuttered like dying heartbeats. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but skeletal trees, and the occasional gleam of eyes that vanished when I looked directly at them. The pickup point was marked by a weathered sign reading, Millfield Crossing, Eastern 1892, and absolutely nothing else. No house, no business, no waiting passenger. Just a rusted mailbox leaning at an impossible angle, and the whisper of wind through bare branches. I pulled to the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires like broken bones. The app showed my passenger as M. Vale, with a 5-star rating and no profile picture. I checked the time, 3:23 a.m. The pickup window had another minute before I could legally cancel and claim the minimum fare. That's when my car lurched, not forward or back, but downward, as if someone had just settled into the rear passenger seat. The suspension groaned softly, and I watched my rearview mirror frame the empty space where a person should be sitting. The black leather showed a clear depression, the kind that forms when weight distributes across the seat, deep enough for someone real. The meter clicked on without my touching it. The mechanical whir of the old digital display filled the cabin as numbers began to roll. 350, 375, 4.0 hours. I reached for the controls, but my GPS screen flickered to life, showing a route I hadn't programmed. The destination appeared as a pulsing red dot with no address, no street name, just coordinates that meant nothing to me. Turn right in 500 feet, the navigation voice announced. Though I hadn't activated the audio, the voice sounded wrong somehow, too crisp, like it was coming from inside my skull rather than the speakers. I should have stopped the ride, should have gotten out, called support, reported a technical malfunction. Instead, I found myself checking the mirror again, studying that depression in the seat. The leather creaked softly, as if shifting under invisible weight. The heating elements in that specific section glowed red through the upholstery, responding to body heat that shouldn't exist. Turn right in 100 feet. My hands obeyed before my mind could object, spinning the wheel as instructed. The car bounced over a cattle guard I hadn't seen in my headlights, and suddenly we were on a dirt road that my GPS definitely shouldn't have known about. This path wasn't on any map. I'd driven every route in the county during my 18 months behind the wheel. The odometer caught my attention, 127,891 miles. I'd been meaning to celebrate hitting 128,000 sometime this week. A small milestone in the grand scheme of things, but significant enough that I'd been watching for it. Static crackled from the radio, though I never listened to AM/FM during rides. Passengers complained about my music choices, so I kept it off, but the radio was definitely on now, tuning itself to a frequency that didn't exist. Between the white noise, I caught fragments of voices. Not music, not talk shows, but something else entirely. Please, someone help. Can't find the road back. How long have I been driving? The sun won't come up. The passenger in my back seat. I can feel them breathing, but there's no one there. I stabbed the power button. The radio died for exactly 3 seconds before crackling back to life. Louder now, the voices overlapping in a chorus of distress that made my teeth ache. Turn left in 200 feet. The GPS showed I was somehow traveling in a perfect circle, though the road ahead appeared straight. According to the display, I'd been driving for 47 minutes and covered 63 miles, which was impossible. The narrow dirt path couldn't support that kind of speed, and I'd been driving carefully, maybe 25 mi at most. The meter continued its relentless climb, 47.25, 47.50, 47.75. I glanced at the rearview mirror again and felt my stomach drop. The depression in the seat had grown deeper, more defined. I could make out the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a head resting against the window. Condensation fogged the glass where breath might have touched it, but there was no one there. My hands were trembling now, and I could taste copper in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. The rational part of my mind, the part that balanced bank statements and changed oil every 3,000 miles, insisted this was some kind of breakdown. Stress-induced hallucination. Too many energy drinks and not enough sleep finally catching up with me. The other part, the primitive lizard brain that still remembered when humans were prey, screamed that I needed to stop the car and run. Continue straight for 12.7 miles. 12.7 miles would complete the circle. I studied the GPS display with growing horror, watching the red line trace its path back toward the starting point. The odometer read 127,943 miles now, climbing steadily toward that 128,000 milestone I'd been anticipating. What happens when it hits 128,000? What happens when the circle closes? The radio voices grew more urgent, more desperate. I caught my own voice among them. The passenger in my back seat. I can feel them breathing, but there's no one there, though I hadn't spoken aloud. Not yet. The weight in the back seat shifted, and I heard the soft whisper of fabric against leather. In the mirror, I watched the depression change shape as if my invisible passenger was leaning forward. The heating element brightened, responding to proximity. My cell phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. We were deep in the void between mapped roads now, following a route that existed only in the GPS memory and whatever intelligence guided the meter's relentless counting. Turn right in 300 feet. I knew this turn. I'd taken it before, though that was impossible. The tree line broke here, revealing a glimpse of sky through bare branches, and for just a moment I saw stars arranged in patterns I didn't recognize, constellations that might have been beautiful if they weren't so wrong. The odometer clicked over, 127,987 miles, 13 miles to go. The temperature in the car had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the glow of the dashboard lights. The heating system ran full blast, but the cold came from behind me, radiating from the space where my passenger sat. I adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to get a better angle, and nearly drove off the road when I saw movement in the reflection. Not a person exactly. More like the absence of a person, a shadow with weight and presence that suggested form without revealing it. When I looked directly at the back seat, nothing. When I watched the mirror, the shape of something that might once have been human, or might someday become human if the circumstances were right. Continue straight for 8.3 miles. The meter read 73.40 and climbing. In my 3 years of driving, I'd never seen a fare that high. The longest ride I'd ever taken was a 2-hour airport run that maxed out at $127. This passenger, this presence, was going to cost more than most people made in a day, if they were planning to pay. if payment was even the point. The radio chatter had resolved into a single voice now, clearer than the others, speaking with the careful diction of a 1940s radio announcer. Ladies and gentlemen, we appear to have a slight detour on tonight's route. The driver wishes to inform passengers that this is a non-stop service to your final destination. Please remain seated until the journey is complete. I hadn't been a passenger when this started, had I? The odometer, 127,995 miles. 5 miles. I could feel my passenger now, not just their weight, but their presence. Like standing too close to a microwave or walking under high-tension power lines. The air itself felt charged, dense with potential energy that made my skin crawl and my vision blur at the edges. Turn left in 500 feet. This was the final turn. I could see it ahead, the familiar cattle guard that would bring us back to Millfield Road. Back to the rusted mailbox and the weathered sign. Back to the beginning. The meter climbed toward $80, and my odometer showed 127,999 miles. 1 mile to go. I pressed the brake pedal. Nothing happened. The car maintained its steady 25 mph, following the GPS route with mechanical precision. I tried the emergency brake, pumped the regular brakes, even shifted into park. The transmission groaned in protest, but we didn't slow down. My passenger leaned forward and I felt breath on the back of my neck that shouldn't exist. Continue straight for 0.8 miles. The odometer rolled over, 128,000 miles, and something fundamental changed. The radio fell silent. The meter stopped climbing. The GPS screen went black. But we kept moving, following a route that no longer needed electronic guidance, pulled forward by something that understood destination in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. I could see the pickup point ahead now, the same weathered sign and rusted mailbox where this had all started. Except now, there was someone waiting there. A figure standing beside the road with their thumb out, face obscured by shadow. They looked familiar. As we approached, I caught a glimpse of the hitchhiker in my headlights. A man in his 30s, stubbled and tired, wearing the same jacket I'd put on 8 hours earlier. He held up a phone showing a ride request notification, and I could see my own license plate reflected in the screen. The weight in my back seat vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. My passenger had arrived at their destination, though I was beginning to understand that arrival and departure were meaningless concepts here. This was a route between spaces, a loop that existed in the gaps of reality where distance folded back on itself. I pulled to the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires like broken bones. The figure by the roadside opened my door and slid behind the wheel with the practiced motion of someone who had done this before, many times before. "Thanks for the ride," he said in my voice, checking the mirror as the car lurched downward in response to new weight in the passenger seat. Long night ahead. I found myself walking toward the pickup point, phone in hand, watching the notification appear on my screen. A ride request from Monsieur Vale, destination unknown, surge pricing active. Behind me, I heard the familiar mechanical whir as the meter clicked on, beginning its count toward the next cycle. The car pulled away, carrying my replacement toward whatever waited at the end of the route. I stood beside the rusted mailbox, thumb extended toward the empty road, and checked my phone for the time. 2:47 a.m. 3 hours I'd been waiting here, watching for that one last ride to make the night profitable. The notification chimed, cutting through the dead silence like a blade. Story 13. The elevator cables groaned like arthritic joints as I descended into the belly of the Meridian Tower at 3:47 a.m. My toolkit rattled against the metal floor with each jolt, the sound unnaturally sharp in the pre-dawn silence that wrapped around corporate buildings like a burial shroud. The server room on the 42nd floor had crashed again, the third time this month, and as the sole night technician for Hartwell Systems, these emergencies fell into my lap like unwanted gifts. I'd been working these graveyard shifts for 8 months now, ever since the company restructured, and half the IT department vanished overnight. The survivors whispered about pink slips and performance reviews. their voices tight with the kind of anxiety that makes people check their email obsessively and flinch at every summons to HR. I understood their fear. In a building where careers died quietly behind closed doors, paranoia became a survival skill. The freight elevator shuddered to a halt on the 42nd floor. But something felt wrong. The panel display flickered erratically, cycling through floor numbers that didn't make sense. 41, 40, 39, then suddenly B1, B2, B3. I'd worked in this building for years and knew it only had 2 basement levels, parking and utilities. Yet there, below the standard basement buttons, sat an unmarked key I'd never noticed before. Black, featureless, positioned where B3 should be. My finger hovered over the button for reasons I couldn't articulate. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights hummed differently here, or how the air tasted metallic, like blood mixed with ozone. The rational part of my mind cataloged this as simple curiosity, but something deeper urged me forward, a compulsion that felt both foreign and familiar. I pressed it. The elevator lurched downward with a grinding sound that seemed to emanate from the building's bones. The descent lasted longer than physics should have allowed, each floor marker blinking past in a countdown to nowhere. The air grew thick and oppressive, pressing against my eardrums until they popped. When the doors finally opened, they revealed a corridor that had no business existing. Raw concrete walls stretched into fluorescent-lit infinity, their surfaces weeping with condensation that caught the light like tears. The floor beneath my feet was polished concrete, cold enough that I could feel its chill through my work boots. But it was the sound that made my skin crawl, a low, persistent humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, vibrating through my chest cavity and settling in my bones like a tuning fork struck against my skeleton. I stepped out hesitantly, the elevator doors sealing behind me with a pneumatic hiss that sounded too final. The corridor extended in both directions, broken only by doorways that gaped like open mouths. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow that made shadows dance at the periphery of my vision. The humming grew louder as I moved forward, not audibly, but somehow more present, as if it were inviting more of itself into my body with each step. The first doorway revealed an office space that made my throat constrict. Cubicles stretched into darkness, their fabric walls a Depression-era gray that absorbed light like a black hole. Computer monitors flickered with screensavers displaying company logos that shifted and distorted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Coffee cups sat abandoned on desks, their contents long since evaporated, leaving behind ring stains that looked like accusatory eyes. But it was the feeling of the place that truly unsettled me. The air itself seemed saturated with anxiety, thick with the psychic residue of hundreds of sleepless nights spent worrying about mortgages and healthcare premiums and children's college tuition. I could almost taste the desperation, bitter and metallic, like pennies dissolved in stomach acid. The humming here wasn't just sound, it was the crystallized essence of every panic attack, every moment of crushing realization that job security was just another corporate myth. I backed out of the office space and continued down the corridor, passing door after door that revealed more of the same. Empty conference rooms with whiteboards covered in illegible strategic planning sessions. Break rooms with refrigerators humming their own minor key harmonies. Supply closets stuffed with boxes labeled with department names that had been dissolved years ago. The humming followed me everywhere, sometimes growing stronger, sometimes fading to a whisper, but never disappearing entirely. It began to feel less like sound and more like a living thing, feeding on my growing unease and using it to sustain itself. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, but the screen showed no signal, no time, just a black mirror that reflected my increasingly haggard face. As I moved deeper into the phantom floor, the architecture began to shift in ways that defied blueprints and building codes. Corridors that should have led back to the elevator instead opened onto more corridors. Rooms that appeared rectangular from the doorway revealed themselves to be impossibly circular once I stepped inside. The ceiling height fluctuated subtly, sometimes forcing me to duck, sometimes stretching so high that my flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. It was in one of these distorted spaces, a break room where the water cooler bubbled with liquid that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite anything else, that I began to understand what this place truly was. The humming here reached a crescendo that made my fillings ache, and suddenly I could hear voices woven into its frequency. Whispered conversations about performance metrics and downsizing, fragment of exit interviews and termination meetings, the collected audio archaeology of a workforce slowly dismantled by corporate indifference. The voices spoke of projects canceled overnight, of pension funds mysteriously depleted, of employees who arrived one Monday to find their keycards deactivated and their desks cleared. They told stories of middle managers who smiled while delivering pink slips, of HR representatives who spoke of workforce optimization with the detached precision of morticians. And underneath it all, the humming grew stronger, fed by each tale of professional destruction. I realized then that I wasn't exploring a basement. I was inside a corporate anxiety made manifest, a psychic tumor that had grown in the building's foundation, nourished by years of collective dread. The phantom floor existed in the space between sleep and waking, between the last employee leaving and the first one arriving, when the building's defenses were down and its accumulated trauma could take physical form. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange clarity. I understood now why I'd been drawn to press that unmarked button. The building had chosen me, recognizing in my own precarious employment status a kindred spirit. I was already halfway to becoming part of its collection, another voice in the humming chorus of the professionally discarded. But knowledge brought power, and with power came the possibility of escape. I remembered the instructions embedded in the premise of this nightmare. Find the point where the humming becomes complete silence, the eye of the storm where the building's hunger couldn't reach. That would be my exit, my salvation. I began moving through the floor with new purpose, using the humming as a sonar system. In some rooms it swelled until I thought my eardrums might burst. In others, it faded to a whisper. I mapped the phantom floor by its emotional topography, seeking the null point where corporate anxiety finally exhausted itself. The search led me through increasingly surreal spaces. A boardroom where the conference table stretched into infinity, lined with chairs that held the ghostly impressions of bodies long since departed. A server room where the machines displayed error messages in languages that didn't exist. An office where family photos on desks showed faces that aged and died in real time, cycling through decades of disappointment in seconds. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time moved differently here, governed by psychological rather than physical laws. My sense of urgency grew as I noticed changes in the environment around me. The fluorescent lights began to flicker more frequently, and in their strobing gaps I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. The building was becoming aware of my purpose, and it didn't approve. Finally, in what appeared to be a supply closet filled with boxes of obsolete technology, keyboards with PS2 connectors, CRT monitors, dot matrix printers that looked like relics from an archaeological dig, I found it. A small space, no larger than a phone booth, where the humming simply stopped. The silence was absolute, more complete than the absence of sound should be. It felt like stepping into a vacuum, where even the sound of my own heartbeat disappeared. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, like emerging from underwater and gasping that first breath of air. But as I stood in that miraculous pocket of quiet, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The distant ding of an elevator arriving at its destination. The phantom floor was preparing to release me, to return me to the world above where fluorescent lights hummed normally, and corporate anxiety remained safely contained within the boundaries of human psychology. I rushed back through the corridors, retracing my path with an urgency bordering on panic. The humming seemed weaker now, less insistent, as if my discovery of the silence point had somehow wounded it. The doorways I passed looked smaller, their contents fading like photographs left too long in sunlight. The elevator doors stood open, waiting. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 42nd floor, not trusting myself to look back at the phantom floor that was already beginning to dissolve behind me. The ascent felt normal, the cables groaning their familiar mechanical symphony, the floor numbers counting upward in their proper sequence. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, I stepped out into a world that looked exactly as I'd left it. Fluorescent lights humming their mundane tune, server racks blinking their electronic semaphore, the familiar smell of ozone and carpet glue. I completed my repairs with mechanical efficiency, replacing failed hard drives and updating firmware, tasks that felt almost absurdly normal after my subterranean odyssey. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I packed my toolkit. The elevator panel showed only the standard buttons: floors 1 through 47, basement levels 1 and 2. The unmarked button was gone, as if it had never existed. I told myself it had been a hallucination, brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. The rational explanation felt solid, comforting in its mundane certainty. But as I descended to the parking garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere below us, in the building's hidden depths, a new voice had joined the humming chorus, mine, captured in the moment I'd stood in that impossible silence, recorded and preserved for the next visitor who would press an unmarked button and descend into the phantom floor. The worst part wasn't uncertainty about what I'd experienced. The worst part was the growing suspicion that I'd never really left at all, that the 42nd floor and the parking garage and the pre-dawn streets were just another layer of the building's dream, another room in its endless collection of corporate anxieties made manifest. Even now, as I write this account in what I believe to be my apartment, I can hear it, faint but persistent, a humming that seems to rise from the floorboards themselves. And sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and office buildings stand empty, I catch myself listening for the ding of an elevator that shouldn't exist, carrying passengers to a floor that feeds on their professional fears and transforms them into its eternal residence. The humming is getting louder. In Story 14. The diesel fumes still clung to my nostrils when I first noticed him. 3:17 a.m. on Interstate 40, somewhere between nowhere and the middle of nothing. My rig had been whining about low fuel for the past 30 miles, and this place, Danny's last stop according to the flickering neon sign, was the only option before the long stretch through the desert. The parking lot stretched out like a concrete wasteland, under buzzing fluorescent lights that cast everything in sickly yellow pools, separated by pools of impenetrable darkness. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing the federal limits, because the delivery in Phoenix couldn't wait. My eyes felt like sandpaper, and the coffee from Flagstaff had turned to battery acid in my gut hours ago. But something about this place made the exhaustion evaporate from my bones, replaced by an alertness that felt wrong, like my nervous system had been plugged into a live wire. The gas station squatted low and wide, its plate glass windows reflecting the harsh parking lot lights back at me in fractured segments. Someone had tried to clean those windows recently. Streaks of dried cleaning solution created abstract patterns across the surface like frozen lightning. To the right of the main building, a small cluster of picnic tables sat under a corrugated metal awning, the kind of afterthought seating area that truck stops add when they want to seem family-friendly. That's where I saw him. He sat at the furthest table, back straight as a fence post, hands folded neatly in front of him. The distance and harsh lighting made details impossible, but something about his posture suggested patience, the kind of infinite, terrible patience that makes you check your watch even when you're not running late. He wore what looked like a dark jacket or shirt, and his hair appeared neat, almost formal. A businessman, maybe, though what business anyone had at Danny's last stop at 3 in the morning was beyond me. The fuel pump clicked and hummed as diesel flowed into my tank. I kept glancing at the man, but he never moved, not once. Most people fidget, shift their weight, check their phones. This guy could have been carved from stone. When someone sits that still for that long, it stops being normal and starts being something else entirely. The pump clicked off at 43 gallons. I replaced the nozzle and headed into the station to pay, the hydraulic door announcing my entrance with a wheeze and a ding. The interior smelled like stale coffee, hot dogs that had been rotating under heat lamps since the Clinton administration, and something vaguely chemical that might have been cleaning fluid or might have been something worse. Behind the counter, a woman in her 50s looked up from a paperback romance novel. Her name tag read Dolores, and she had the weathered look of someone who'd been working graveyard shifts long enough to lose track of what day it was. I told her the pump number and she rang it up without conversation, which suited me fine. But as she counted my change, I found myself asking about the man outside. She followed my gesture toward the windows, squinting past the reflection of the fluorescent lights. For a moment, her expression remained neutral, professional. Then something shifted, a tightening around her eyes that she tried to hide by looking down at the register. "Don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had the careful quality of someone choosing their words with unusual precision. I persisted, describing the man's position at the furthest table, his stillness, his formal posture. As I spoke, Dolores's hands grew increasingly busy with unnecessary tasks, straightening a display of beef jerky, adjusting the position of a lottery ticket dispenser, wiping down a counter that was already clean. "Sometimes people stop to rest," she finally said, still not meeting my eyes. "Long drive ahead, maybe. Coffee gets cold fast out there this time of night." But she hadn't looked outside again, and when I asked if she knew how long he'd been sitting there, she claimed she'd been busy with inventory and hadn't noticed anyone at all. Back outside, the night air carried a chill that hadn't been there before. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, as if someone had turned down their intensity while I was inside. Or maybe my eyes were just getting tired. The man remained exactly where I'd left him, in exactly the same position. If I hadn't known better, I'd have sworn he hadn't breathed once in the 10 minutes I'd been gone. My truck cab sat 20 feet away, close enough that I could make out the small details I'd memorized over thousands of miles. The crack in the passenger side windshield that looked like a spider web, the CB radio antenna bent at an odd angle from a close encounter with a low bridge in Colorado, the collection of air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirror that I'd accumulated at truck stops across the country. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed to life with its familiar rumble, and I adjusted the mirrors as I always did, part superstition, part habit. The passenger side mirror showed the parking lot stretching away behind me, painted in the harsh glow of the sodium lights. The rearview mirror captured a slice of the area behind my trailer, including a perfect view of the picnic tables, including the man. And that's when I saw it. In the mirror, he blinked. Not a quick flutter of eyelids, but a slow, deliberate closing and opening that seemed to take far longer than any human blink should. The movement was so pronounced, so obvious, that I immediately turned to look directly at him through the passenger window. He sat motionless, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead with the same glassy fixation he'd maintained since I'd first spotted him. But in the mirror, I checked again. Those same eyes had closed once more. Another impossibly slow blink that lasted 3 full seconds. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Fatigue could cause hallucinations, I knew that. 11 hours of driving, caffeine crashes, eye strain from oncoming headlights. All of it could conspire to make you see things that weren't there. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. I forced myself to conduct a simple test. I would watch him directly for 30 seconds, then check the mirror, then look back. When I stared at him through the window, he remained perfectly still, eyes open, hands folded. When I shifted my attention to the rearview mirror, the reflection showed the same scene, the same posture, except for the eyes. In the reflection, they moved independently, tracking left and right, as if scanning the parking lot with predatory interest. The logical part of my brain offered explanations. Trick of the light, reflection distortion, multiple mirrors creating optical illusions. But logic felt thin and inadequate against the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. I put the truck in gear and began to roll forward, intending to simply leave. As I drove past the picnic area, I kept the man in my peripheral vision. He didn't turn his head to track my movement, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. But in the side mirror, his reflection was standing now, watching my truck with obvious interest. 20 feet from the parking lot exit, I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because my foot seemed to move to the brake of its own accord. Some instinct deeper than thought was screaming warnings. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at the darkened highway ahead, feeling sweat gather at the base of my neck despite the cool air seeping through the window seals. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound, rhythmic and patient. Tap, 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 like fingernails against glass. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing oddly in the confined space of the cab. I checked the windows. Nobody there. Checked the mirrors. The man's real body still sat motionless at the table, but his reflection was now standing beside my truck, one hand raised as if knocking on glass I couldn't see. The tapping grew more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Always 3 beats, always the same rhythm, like a code or a heartbeat. I reached for the CB radio to call for help, but as my fingers touched the microphone, I caught sight of the small convex mirror I'd mounted on the passenger side to eliminate blind spots. The reflection in that mirror was different. Where my main mirrors showed the man standing beside the truck, this smaller mirror revealed him sitting in my passenger seat, his hands folded in his lap just as they had been at the picnic table. But now I could see his face clearly for the first time. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, eyes that held no iris or pupil, just flat, reflective surfaces like mirrors themselves. His mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the engine noise, but I could read his lips well enough. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. I jerked my eyes away from the mirror to look directly at the passenger seat. Empty. Of course it was empty. But when I checked the mirror again, he was still there, still mouthing those same 3 words with increasing urgency. Understanding hit me like cold water. He wasn't just visible in reflections. He existed only in reflections. The real world held nothing but an empty shell, a decoy to draw attention while the actual entity lived in the mirror realm, using reflective surfaces as windows into our world. The tapping intensified, and now I could hear it coming from multiple directions. Every mirror in the cab, rear view, side mirrors, the small convex ones I used for backing up, all of them showed him in different positions, different angles, all tapping against their respective surfaces with increasing desperation. My hand moved toward the key to shut off the engine, but I stopped myself. If I turned off the truck, I'd lose the slight vibration that was currently making the mirrors shake. Steady mirrors would give him clearer access, better focus. The tapping might become something worse. Instead, I put the truck in gear and accelerated toward the highway. But as I drove, every reflective surface became a potential threat. The side mirrors showed him running alongside the truck with impossible speed, his mouth open in what might have been a scream or might have been laughter. Chrome bumpers and fuel tanks on other vehicles revealed glimpses of him darting between lanes of traffic that existed only in the reflection realm. The worst part was the GPS screen mounted on my dashboard. Its black surface had become a mirror when the screensaver activated, and in its reflection I could see him sitting directly behind me, leaning forward as if about to whisper in my ear. I needed to get away from reflective surfaces, but that was impossible in a modern vehicle. Everything was chrome and glass and polished metal. Every surface potentially harbored his presence. Miles rolled by in a nightmarish parade of mirror glimpses. Sometimes he appeared calm, sitting in various seats throughout the cab like a patient passenger. Other times he seemed agitated, pressing his hands against the glass as if trying to break through. And occasionally, worst of all, he wasn't there at all, leaving me to wonder if he'd found a way out or if he was simply hiding, waiting for the right moment. The first hints of dawn began to creep across the horizon when I finally understood his limitation. In bright sunlight, reflections become harder to see, washed out by competing light. If I could just reach daylight, maybe I could escape whatever hold he had on me. But as the sun rose, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the growing light, I could see my own reflection clearly in the rearview mirror for the first time since leaving the gas station, except it wasn't quite my reflection anymore. The face looking back at me had my features, my clothes, my trucking hat, but the eyes held that same flat, reflective quality I'd seen in his face. And as I watched in growing horror, my reflection began to mouth words that I wasn't speaking, forming phrases with lips that moved independently of my own. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. I still don't know if I'm the trucker who encountered something impossible at Danny's last stop, or if I'm the reflection that somehow escaped its mirror prison. Some mornings I wake up convinced I'm real, made of flesh and blood and memories. Other times I catch myself in a mirror and feel uncertain about which side of the glass I'm really on. The only thing I know for certain is that I can't stop driving. Every time I try to get out of the truck, every time I approach a building with too many reflective surfaces, I feel myself starting to fade around the edges, becoming translucent and insubstantial. So I keep moving, staying on highways, avoiding places where mirrors multiply like rabbit holes into other worlds. And sometimes, late at night when I'm pulled over at a rest stop, I see other truckers staring at me through their side mirrors with expressions of confusion and growing fear. They see me sitting motionless in my cab, hands folded, eyes wide open and unblinking. But they can't see what I'm really doing in their mirrors. What I'm always doing. Tap, tap, tap.